Lord of the Mysteries, Fire of Destruction, chapter 334 to 337. All the demigods and civilians near the tree froze. The earth shook again with pain, the few remaining houses were reduced to rubble, and to the horror of the church forces and the great joy but confusion of the Rose School, the crimson tree began to grow as the intensity of its glow increased. Its height reached such points that the top of the tree disappeared into the storm clouds. Ace Snake and Saturna had to step aside to avoid being struck by the raging bolts of lightning that began to attack the tree but could never touch it. What's happening now? Ace Snake snarled in annoyance, the lightning that surrounded his body thundering with rage. Saturna just looked at the tree, her expression hard to read. But there was confusion in her cold eyes. Suddenly, both demigods looked down at the base of the tree. Sweat suddenly covered their foreheads. Their spirituality screamed the same thing. Danger. The ground cracked again. Thick, fleshy roots spread out and destroyed the remains of the buildings, revealing a huge platform with a huge, deformed baby in the middle, cramped and hidden in the remains of what appeared to be a womb. Ace Snake's spirituality told him all he needed to know. A mighty bolt of lightning charged and was ready to go, but before he could act, a mighty thunderbolt struck and tried to strike the baby. And it wasn't the only one, a ridiculous amount of lightning and thunder struck, all aimed at the same target. But before the thunder could reach any dangerous distance, it was stopped by what appeared to be a crimson barrier. The baby was further enveloped by the remnants of the womb, fear on its hideous face as it looked up at the black, thundering storm clouds above. The few civilians present, those who survived the initial explosion and the monsters that followed, watched the creature on the platform in horror and great pain. The image would remain etched in their minds along with a splitting headache. The cold of this rainy day added to it. A woman in an extremely damaged, dust-covered, blood-stained dress looked at the incredible scene before her from her hiding place in the rubble and could only weep. All around her, more people were hiding with her. There were a few children, but mostly just adults. "We are lost. I want my mummy," cried a little girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, in the arms of a man who could only hold her tight as he tried to keep her quiet. "Shut that brat up before the demons find us. Please, goddess, protect us." Looking at what was happening behind her, Margaret could only give a shaky sigh and wipe the tears from her reddened eyes. Looking at the horrific scene in front of her, Margaret raised her hands and clasped them together. "Please. A miracle, please." The woman wept as she prayed to whatever deity might hear her, but the only thing around her besides the destruction and death was the storms and lightning that tried to destroy the crimson barrier. Gritting her teeth and on the verge of collapse, Margaret closed her eyes and cried out to the only savior she knew, "Save us, please. Mr. Kenway." Suddenly, at the end of the barrier, the earth shook and cracked. A pillar of golden fire shot up and faced the crimson light. This pillar caught the attention of all present, who stared in disbelief. At the top of it, a figure shot out. Golden flames covered part of his body and his red hair danced in the air, a fiery stone sword in his hand. "You thought you could outrun me?" Everything seemed to freeze. The demigods and the people of East Borough watched as the familiar man faced the monster on the platform. A bloody smile on his bruised face and burning eyes lit the fire of hope in their weary hearts. "What is he doing here? Is he crazy?" Ace Snake shouted in disbelief as he saw someone he thought was dead. "How is he still alive?" Saturna shouted angrily as she looked at the man. "He should have been killed." The surviving people of East Borough looked at the man, tears falling from their eyes, not of sadness but of immense joy. Margaret cried out in joy as she fell limply to her knees. Similar cries surrounded the crater, shouting his name. "Mr. Kenway." The fire mage had returned. As soon as the baby saw the red-haired man, an expression of horror appeared on his face, and he raised his deformed arms to cover it, the natural movement of any baby at the sight of something that frightens it. As if sensing his fear, the fleshy trunks wrapped themselves around him like a protective cocoon, twisting around each other like skinless snakes until they formed a huge ball of bleeding, throbbing reddish flesh. In the next instant, black spikes erupted from the trunks, oozing a dark, thick black liquid. They pointed everywhere, their tips as sharp as the most dangerous spears. Seeing this, Adrian clicked his tongue. His agitated breathing didn't have much effect as he took another step, using Wach to propel himself a little higher. Dust and pieces of rock covered him, clinging to the fresh blood from his wounds. His eyes moved quickly around him, an emptiness forming in his stomach at such a ruinous landscape. Whether the emptiness was because he still had some emotions or because they were empty, the redhead did not know. He might have seen the destruction caused by the emergence of the tree thanks to Chicho, but to see it for himself was something else entirely. Houses and buildings had been completely destroyed. Streets were gone, and wrecks of carriages and corpses were sticking out of the rubble. Dust, smoke, and fire as far as he could see. Beyond that, rolling in like a raging wave, huge numbers of what he could best describe as ghouls were coming towards him. Running over debris and corpses, ignoring even living people, their goal was clear. Adrian watched all this with empty eyes as he took another step with Sky Wach and soared even higher. His eyes moved around him, and he let out a small sigh. This is really annoying. He didn't know if Chicho's barrier was still standing, there was no sign to tell him, so he had to assume that it had fallen. That would mean that any enemy could join the battle, making everything even more difficult. In his current state, he was sure that he would not be able to withstand another fight as brutal as the last one. His body was already at its maximum limit, and he no longer had regeneration. His spirituality was almost full, but that would mean nothing if he had to use 1/3 of it to fire a plasma beam. No sooner had he left the ground than he noticed the crimson barrier covering the base of the tree where the baby and he were standing. If that thing didn't turn to ash as soon as it lifted its misshapen head to the surface, it was because of that barrier. A defense system, perhaps. It didn't even let in the rainwater, for which he was grateful. The redhead nodded inwardly. If the baby hadn't been blown to dust, it was because of this barrier, which seemed to come out of the tree itself and encompassed a large area around the platform. A plan quickly formed in his tired mind, and the corners of his lips lifted slightly at what was coming. If his theory was wrong, he would be nothing but dust in the next 5 seconds. What does it matter at this point? All or nothing. So, all things considered, Adrian pushed himself as high as he could but stayed inside the crimson barrier. Ace Snake watched as the redhead continued to rise and could only frown. What does he think he's doing? Is he trying to escape? The Archbishop of the Holy Wind Cathedral was quite confused by what the man was doing. What was he trying to achieve? Saturna, for her part, could only growl inwardly. She had failed to find the chosen ones to protect the divine vessel in the rubble of the platform. Had the fire mage defeated them? All 5 of them? He was only one man. How could one man have defeated 5 of their agents? Having reached the highest point, Adrian inhaled as much air as he could. His chest swelled, his not quite healed bones protesting, but like the last few minutes, they were ignored. Pouring spirituality into his throat, Adrian screamed. The spirituality increased the power of his voice, and the conspirator's natural ability to scream made his voice sound like he was speaking into an amplifier. Hear me, church dogs. Ace Snake's expression broke, and he stared at the red-haired man in disbelief, momentarily speechless. Elsewhere on the ground, Horamek Haydn's expression also cracked slightly, the corners of his bearded lips quivering. The holes in his back closed, and his robe covered his back again. The Archbishop's old eyes couldn't help but widen slightly as he looked up at the source of the scream. I have to admit, the young man has courage. He commented with some respect as his arm opened again and fired a purification cannon at the demon that was trying to sneak through the shadows toward him. For once in your damn life, do your job and protect the people of East Borough. Cover for me, and I'll finish this. You heard me, you useless waste of humans. Who does this brat think he is? The veins in his neck began to throb, but before Ace Snake could say anything in righteous retaliation, he saw Adrian pointing to the sky, to the storms that were raging with even more fury than before. And you tin pot gods keep your heavy asses in your ugly chairs. You don't make the last call until I die. Craboom. A thunderclap struck and tried to hit Adrian, but the crimson barrier blocked the attack and protected the redhead. Red-haired Adrian looked up at the sky in annoyance. A vein throbbed in his forehead, and a mad grin spread across his face. You really are an annoying pigeon, you know that. What? You want some bread to calm you down a bit, Miss Pigeon? Just be careful not to dirty your dress. Crabium mm. Another clap of thunder fell, but the barrier blocked it again. Instead of saying anything else, Adrian just raised his middle finger at the storm clouds as he let out a maniacal laugh. Despite the thunderous roar, The explosions in the distance, and the mighty wind that swept over East Borough, everything seemed to fall silent. All present, civilians and demigods alike, stared in disbelief and astonishment at the man in the sky. He just insulted the gods, and despite receiving divine punishment and surviving, he just insulted them again. The demigods and beyonders present thought the same thing in shock. The scenario before them was so ridiculous that they could not believe it. Ignoring the stares, Adrian lowered his gaze to the thorny bud at the base of the tree. The fleshy, thorn-covered trunks struck him with familiarity, and he realized that they were exactly the same ones the doctor had used. The energy-sucking ivies. They look much bigger and stronger than the ones the doctor used. If I try to destroy them like I did cells, they'll no doubt drain me of what's left of my spirituality before I can get to the damn baby. Adrian grunted as the armor covered him again. Crabium. Glancing back to where the thunder had struck the barrier, Adrian's expression under his helmet was one of confusion, the anger gone and an eyebrow raised. Annoyed pigeon can't be so childish as to want to destroy me just because I called him that. Recognition glinted in his eyes as another thunderclap struck the barrier. It's not that he's angry. He's trying to tell me something. Clicking his tongue, Adrian lowered his hand and formed a golden fireball. A fireball that began to grow and burn white. It didn't take a genius to understand what the Lord of Storms was trying to tell him. Turning his attention to the sky, the red-haired man watched in alarm as the clouds no longer looked black but white, thanks to the ridiculous amount of lightning churning inside them. They seemed ready to explode and destroy everything. A sea of pure lightning and fierce winds, concentrating into a bomb that would wipe out a city off the map. There is almost no time left. Adrian poured more spirituality into the fireball below him. Backland would be leveled at any moment. He had to end this now. As he watched the thorny trunks, threads of strength shot from his body into the fireball as it began to change shape. Ads by PubFuture. He already knew how to solve the problem of destroying the thorny trunks. He could not use a torrent of fire or a normal fireball, the former because the connection would drain him, and the latter would not have enough power. The threads wove together to form the chest and tail. The white sacred fire followed the path created by the thread and began to take shape. The plasma beam was discarded. Though he felt that the attack could easily pass through the trunks, he knew that if it went through so many layers, it would lose its power and fail to do the necessary damage. Not to mention that the spirituality would be absorbed before it could do any serious damage. The white fire's steps through the invisible threads created a spectacle worthy of an opera from a fantasy novel. The fire danced in the air, following its master's fingers and will in an aggressive yet elegant dance. A dance of blood and fire. Looking at the tattoo on his forearm, Adrian quickly changed the soldier's configuration. The human form changed into that of a flame. Charging the soldier into the creation beneath him, Adrian couldn't help but smile as he tied his feet to the creature's back with threads that began to vibrate. He didn't know how big he could make his soldiers now that he was in Sequence 6, there was no time to test it, nor did he have the luxury of wasting spirituality in a situation like this. But now that he was in Sequence 6, he found a simple solution to this problem. His soldiers could take on the appearance of animals and humans, but nothing would change their true nature. They were soldiers of fire, soldiers charged and given physical form by his spirituality. The eyes of his creation flared into reddish-orange flames, a mighty roar echoing through the shattered streets of deep East Borough. An extinct creature had come back to life from Adrian's own will. He had expended more than half of his spirituality to create the body, and now the soldier was making sure it would not drain him any further. Adrian felt his head throbbing with the ravings, but he endured them. The euphoric smile on his face was followed by a laugh, a crazy, maniac laugh. That's Ace mumbled in disbelief. His eyes were dazed, unable to find words for the ridiculous scenario unfolding beneath him. Saturna stared at the creature, mouth agape. Her battle with the Sea King was momentarily forgotten by the recent events. Quote. That, Horimic Haydn whispered in admiration, his hand scratching his beard in curiosity. Quote. What an annoying brat. The demon Tuclero growled as he raised his magma sword and waved it at the Archbishop of the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. The figure that was now hiding on the other side of the battlefield had a very surprised look on her face that quickly turned into a satisfied and sensual grin. Foo, how very interesting. Quote. This is. Margaret whispered. She did not understand or believe what she was seeing. They should only be creatures of legends or even of church history. It was easily recognizable, but she found what she saw difficult for that very reason. All the civilians who saw them shared the same thoughts, even those who never went to church and those who couldn't read because they had heard stories about them growing up. Stories told by their parents to help them sleep on an empty stomach. A creature that captured princesses, possessed a vast treasure and was defeated by a knight in armor to save the damsel in distress. A creature that every man in their youth wished they could defeat. With a body of white fire and golden glitter, with huge wings and a long tail that flapped in the wind. With sharp teeth and deep reddish-orange eyes that blazed like forest fires in the darkest of nights. RRROOOOOAAAAARRRR. The albino dragon let out a mighty roar that shook the hearts of all present. The magma sword in his hand blazed, the golden armor covering him, and the scarlet eyes in his helmet gave him the appearance of a knight. Audrian thought for a moment. This soldier had followed him for a long time and had been at his side in dangerous times. He did not deserve a name like Ñoño. Not after such outstanding service. The name of an obese child from a 70s TV Mexican comedy was not something that would roll off the tongue. Looking at the huge beast he was now riding, a beast easily as big as a two-story house, he knew immediately what his name would be. Grinning sharply under his mask, Audrian reached out and formed a golden fireball that began to shrink rapidly. A low shriek carried on the wind, and the ball began to burn white. Letting out a wild laugh, he shouted at the top of his lungs, "Open the way, I near." Roar. Roaring and flapping his wings, the now named Ignir swooped towards the thorny cocoon at great speed. The wind whistled, and his furious, reddish eyes focused on his target. Alarm flashed across the face of Saturna as she tried to get to where the knight was going to protect the divine vessel, but her path was cut off by an extremely angry ace snake. I can't believe I'm protecting a psychopath. The demigod spat in anger, which was reflected in the lightning bolts he hurled at Saturna. The demigoddess could only abandon her previous attack and dodge the thunderbolts that almost hit her in her haste. Taking advantage of the seconds and using the wind to amplify his voice, Ace Snake shouted to the four winds. Listen to me, Punishers. New orders. The demigod paused for a moment, finding it difficult to say what he had to say, but the thunder that threatened to rain down on Backlund gave him all the motivation he needed. With huge veins pulsing in his neck and forehead, Ace Snake roared. Protect Audrian Kenway. Demon Tuclero found himself in the same situation, only he was cut off by Horamic Haydn, who had a serious look on his old face. We still have business to attend to, so I can't let you go. Besides, the older ones have to take care of the younger ones. The demon clicked his snake-like tongue. The green fireballs dancing around him swooped viciously at his enemy, whose back opened, and missiles shot out. You heard the Punishers. Machine hive mind. Don't let them through. The forces of the three churches cut down the forces of the Rose School on earth and in the sky, all understanding their purpose. It soared through the air, accompanied by a screeching sound that grew louder and louder. The dragon's wings flapped with power, and tied to its back with threads was the knight Audrian, who held a rapidly shrinking white orb in his left hand. Sensing danger, the giant ivies moved. The ground cracked again, and out of it came snakes like ivies shooting into the air towards them. Eager to knock the albino bird out of the sky. When the red-haired man saw what was coming, he didn't waste a second and prepared himself. Ignir. Audrian ordered as he tightened the strings on his feet and torso. The dragon just let out a mighty roar, and his massive body began to maneuver, barely dodging the prickly flesh snakes. With swift and sudden movements, Ignir zigzagged through the explosive defense with the same intensity. Not yet, Audrian whispered without blinking, clinging tightly to his soldier's back. His eyes were on the cocoon beneath him at all times. Ignir moved violently and extremely roughly, the knight on his back certain to have flown away by now were it not for the threads that bound him to his back. The huge, nightmarish ivies brushed past them, the thorns almost licking at their bodies. If they so much as collided with one, or if a single thorn struck one of them, they would die. Gritting his teeth, the red-haired man poured more spirituality into the orb in his left hand before finally releasing the magma sword, which returned to a jet stone stuck to his side. Not yet. Not yet. Each time, the attacks came closer and closer, more and more desperate to stop them. The earth was cracking more and more flesh snakes coming out of it to attack them. A widening chasm formed beneath the platform, into which the remains of the streets and buildings fell. Nearing the cocoon, the bullet in his left hand was almost ready. Suddenly, from the same abyss, a huge number of thorny trunks shot out at an enormous speed, too many for a Dryan to count. Venomous, angry, hungry snakes. There was no space between them. The flesh snakes were so tightly entwined that they seemed to merge into a single wave of rotting, poisonous flesh. Seeing this, a Dryan continued straight ahead. The dragon Ignir did not change direction but accelerated even further, with the full intention of crashing head-on into that wave of death. Now, a Dryan's mouth opened under his helmet. A terrible scream echoed across the battlefield. It was the cry that he had stolen from the baby earlier. The attack's target, the wave of thorn and death, instantly shattered. The giant ivies twisted and bled a black liquid as they fell into the abyss beneath the platform. The ivies that formed the cocoon were not spared. The outer layer of the cocoon released black jets, and the force that bound them weakened, causing some of the ivies to fall limply. The path to the cocoon had been opened. There was no more protection. Ignir charged like a furious meteor, the impact with the thorny cocoon sending dust and debris flying. The cocoon trembled and wept from the impact, its red flesh burning from the sunfire that was the soldier-turned-dragon's body. Ruah aaarrr. Slash. Hash. Bash. Pam. Its sharp white claws ripped, tore, slashed, and tore at everything in its path. Black blood spurted like geysers from the severed trunks, a black rain covering the platform. Its own snout joined the carnage, its teeth like blades biting and chewing, quickly making its way to the seed inside the fruit. Crack, crack, slash, fush, crack, splat. A Dryan had already raised his arm and palm up, ready to fire, as soon as a window opened and he could see the baby. His spirituality flared, and without thinking, he took a mighty leap out of the cocoon. Not a second later, a huge ivy shot out of the cocoon and pierced Ignir's chest, passing easily through his body and out his back. And it didn't stop there, it began to chase the red-haired man, who was forced to dodge the chasing ivy. Despite being pierced through the chest and rapidly losing his white color, Ignir continued his brutal attack. He was not a blood dragon. Such an attack would not kill him. Another ivy pierced Ignir's body, but he didn't care. His claws and teeth moved furiously, tearing at the ivy that was rapidly draining his strength. The previous attack was already losing its effect, and the ivy was regaining its strength. His albino color soon turned to gold. One of his wings was gone, and his tail was cut off. More than 16 ivies pierced his body, but the dragon didn't care. He wanted to fulfill what his lord had commanded. More ivy shot out, twisting around his legs and tearing them off. Ignir roared furiously and gave the cocoon a mighty headbutt, opening his snout and grabbing as much of the ivy as he could, pulling it off with one last effort. An intense crimson light suddenly appeared. A window had opened, and an annoying baby monster was looking at the dragon that had broken its defenses. A few last ivies wrapped around Ignir's great golden neck, and as the thorns sank into his body, it clenched with monstrous force. The dragon's head was severed, and its body vanished into golden dust. A Dryan watched his soldier fall without emotion, taking another step into the air and barely dodging the ivy that rushed toward him. The golden dust of his fallen soldier enveloped the red-haired man's forearm, forming a somewhat opaque golden tattoo in the shape of a flame. With a mighty leap powered by Sky Wach, a Dryan let out a silent sigh. I'm 60 meters away. That was far beyond the effective distance the plasma beam needed to do the necessary damage. Even if he fired now, the attack would lose too much power, and he would not have enough spirituality to create another fire dragon to repeat the process. Ads by PubFuture. In midair, upside down, with a sea of destruction above his feet and the abyss itself beneath him, the knight looked through the hole Ignir had made. Through the remains of the ivy trunks, black blood, and burnt flesh. Though he shouldn't, given the structure of his mouth, the baby gave him an arrogant smile. A clear mockery on the part of the abomination, who let out a giggle as the remaining logs lunged at it, and the hole began to close. A baby's giggle came from it, filled with arrogance. As the huge, Sharp trunks that had killed his soldier approached. Adrian let out only a slight chuckle, which quickly turned into a maniacal cackle. None of that mattered. He'd already found the solution. He raised his arm and pointed at the baby, whose smile froze on his horrified face. The burning eyes, accompanied by a sharp smile, Adrian laughed as he crossed his fingers. The super-condensed white sphere resting between them now. Say hello to your whores of mothers for me. Instead of releasing the energy in a burst of super-condensed plasma energy, as he had been doing all along, Adrian flickered his fingers. Craboom! With a rumble that could only be compared to the thunder that rumbled high in the sky between the black storm clouds. The battlefield was bathed in a blinding white light that shot toward the cocoon hole at a ridiculous speed. It was so intense that, for a moment, it completely dazzled the tree's crimson glow. The spear, which was the white orb, flew through the tiny crevices in the ivy with murderous intent. The repair of the cocoon was not slow but not fast enough. The marble went through the window Ignir had made and, like an arrow hitting its target, it hit the baby's chest. Adrian watched the attack all the way to the moment it touched the baby, but the man couldn't see what had happened next. He couldn't see the explosion because as soon as the bullet touched the baby, he felt something tugging at him. Suddenly, much faster than his exhausted and suffering mind could process, the landscape before him changed. He no longer saw the towering, misshapen trunk of the crimson tree or the way its attack struck the baby directly. As far as Adrian could tell, he was now in a forest. None of the trees looked familiar. The abrupt change of scenery left him slightly dazed. For a moment, Adrian stood on guard, his armor shining a little brighter, and he was about to grab the stone at his waist. But as quickly as he prepared to defend himself, he calmed himself as he saw a giant behind him, holding his shoulder with a ridiculously large, pale hand. Despite the holy flames, the hand was undamaged. Lord Kenway, I'd appreciate it if you didn't try to burn me. A familiar voice spoke to him, and the red-haired man couldn't help but let out a hollow laugh. The armor that covered him disappeared with a sigh, revealing his torn, tattered, and rather melted clothes. His torso, barely covered by the remains of his shirt, was covered in wounds and horrible bruises that even the dirt that covered him could not hide. His right arm was still completely covered in black cracks. Turning and looking at his messenger with tired eyes, Adrian gave a weak smile. Next time. You're going to help me. She looked the same as the last time he saw her, with no visible wounds and just as fresh. His messenger didn't look like she'd come from holding an angel. Looking at his contractor, Chicho's lips lifted. I'll think about it. Hey, clever girl. Adrian laughed wearily. His gaze lifted a little higher from the pearly eyes of his messenger to the sky. Aming's gray storm clouds and rising at the highest point of the gray fog, the sun illuminated everything. In the distance, he could see a city with some clouds of smoke coming out of it, no doubt that city was Backland. The sunlight warmed the cold in his soul and embraced him with its warmth. He felt he could sleep right there, the tiredness in his body only grew with the rain bathing him. Adrian said nothing, just closed his eyes and let the light of the celestial object fall on his face. It had been more than 72 hours since he had felt the warmth of midday. A warm smile spread across his dirty face. It stayed like that for several seconds. Or was it minutes? To be honest, the redhead didn't care at that moment. Chicho said nothing, giving him time to bathe in the warm light, something he appreciated. Deciding he had had enough, Adrian opened his eyes, ignoring the sensation of looking directly into the sun and moving his eyes back to the phoenix. I doubt you have anything to eat. Still smiling, Chicho pulled a small chocolate bar from behind her back. I thought you might be in the mood for something sweet. Still smiling, he took a rather big bite of the chocolate bar, and about 1/3 of it disappeared. Tasting something other than his blood for the first time in 3 days, the redhead let out a satisfied sigh. Foo-foo. Some chocolate will be good. Adrian commented as he took another bite. Tell me, did you manage to kill any of the demigods or the angel? Unfortunately, no. The angel of the Rose School proved to be quite capable. Even so, I managed to hurt her badly. She won't be a problem for a while. Huh. Chicho nodded. With a chocolate of her own in her hand and some in her mouth, she looked off in the distance. Lord Adrian, would you like me to take you with the rest of your team? Licking his fingers of the chocolate, Not caring in the least about the dirt, Adrian nodded. His eyes were weighing him down and his vision was quickly becoming blurred. At any moment, he would pass out, he was sure of it. And to be honest, he wouldn't mind sleeping in a place as quiet as this, even if it was raining, but he would prefer to rest somewhere near his team and change into some dry clothes. The phoenix said nothing more, taking the red-haired man's left shoulder again. Her pearly eyes were drawn for a moment to the man's broken right arm. Shaking her head, a door of light formed in front of them. It opened, and inside was the familiar small church covered in gold. It was surrounded by debris and had a few broken windows, but otherwise, the Earth Mother's church had suffered little damage. They both stepped forward, intending to go through the door, but just before they entered, they both froze. The light gate suddenly lost all its brightness, and the next second, it was erased, like a drawing on paper. All the light in the clearing was dimmed, absorbed by the figure that had suddenly appeared a few meters away from the duo. A woman with long black hair and eyes, wearing a dark robe and with fine features, cut them off. Before he could process what he saw, Chicho had already grabbed him and jumped back with a look of horror on her face. Another door formed behind them, but like the previous one, it lost its luster and was extinguished as soon as it formed. Before Chicho could do anything else, a ridiculous pressure completely covered the clearing. The light faded even further and they both fell to their knees, trembling. Adrian's spirituality was triggered. Sweat covered his body again, and a shiver ran down his spine. His heart pounded with terror in his chest, and his pupils shrank to mere dots. The terror-suppressing effect of Talk Millennium on his stomach was completely overwhelmed, unable to suppress the absolute terror emanating from the woman in front of him. The original story said that if you saw her on the street, you would not pay much attention to her appearance, that she was just a somewhat beautiful woman to simple eyes. But Adrian couldn't disagree more. He would recognize that look anywhere. 0 to 17. The vessel of the Evernight goddess. Adrian shivered with fear. Any command he wanted to give his body was completely forgotten. The sheer terror that swept over him completely blinded his mind. A blank expression adorned 017's thin face, it never changed. Those eyes, like the night, moved to Chicho for a moment before returning to him. Huff, huff, huff. His heart was about to explode, beating so hard it was more like a Formula One engine. His breathing was ridiculously agitated, and a thick layer of sweat covered his entire body. He couldn't do anything. That was all he knew and felt. Fear and helplessness grew as his body began to be erased, starting with his foot and quickly moving up his leg. If he could move his head, he was sure that Chicho was in a similar state. 017's expression didn't change at all. Cold eyes stared directly at him, staring so directly that Adrian felt his very soul was exposed. Unable to maintain eye contact, the redhead could only lower his head through clenched teeth. His eyes wandered to his disappearing leg. Strangely, he couldn't help but notice that even though he was watching his leg being erased as if it was the wrong answer in a test, it didn't hurt. A small consolation in a shitty situation big enough to fill 5 stadiums. Watching helplessly as his leg disappeared, Adrian was confused when the erasure suddenly froze. Please rest, master, I will take it from here. Single quote exclamation mark single quote. The familiar voice echoed in his head, and before he could call out its name, his eyes rolled back, and he fell unconscious. In the next instant, a black robe covered him completely. It all happened in less than an instant. 017's blank expression broke. The delicate black eyebrows rose to almost touch her hair. Her hand shot up, trying to grasp something invisible. Suddenly, a black bolt of lightning shot out of the void and struck her square in the middle of the forehead. The light suddenly returned to normal, released by the huge presence of 0 to 17, her hands covering her face. Blood dripped from between the fingers. Just as the light returned, a door of indistinguishable light formed beneath the unconscious body of the red-haired man who fell into it. Chicho stepped through another door, the Phonix also dripping blood from her reddened eyes, nose, and ears. Her skin was much paler than before. The giant barely managed to close the door before everything in the clear of the forest was engulfed in darkness. In an alley of backland, a door of indistinct light formed and opened, something came out of it, then closed and disappeared. A body fell to the damp ground with a thud, a robe as black as the darkest night enveloping its form and twisting in upon itself. Adrian's unconscious body lay face down, so deep in the alley that his only companions were the shadows of the alley. Shadows that had suddenly grown so dark that they absorbed all light. Deep within those shadows, there seemed to be countless eyes, each one staring at the only living creature in the alley. Suddenly, the curtains of shadow opened, and someone walked with a quiet step. He was a rather tall man, wearing fine black robes that were tied at his waist by a black cord with beautiful details woven into it. His hair was extremely long and silky, reaching easily down his lower back. His bright scarlet eyes glittered and were further exalted by the shadows that seemed to embrace his figure. Tap, tap, tap. Standing by Adrian's side, Scarlet Eyes stared at the man on the ground. A low, deep chuckle came from his lips. He dropped to one knee, not caring how the dirt ruined his fine robes, and reached out a hand to the man. The black robe that enveloped him reacted. For a moment, it tried to grab the arm of the one who was about to attack its master. But as soon as it touched him, it stopped. After a few seconds, the robe that covered Adrian vanished, leaving his body exposed once more. The ever-present shadows moved, covering the red-haired man's body in a dark tide. After a few moments, the tide of shadows receded. The horrible bruises and wounds on Adrian's body were gone, as were the dark bags under his eyes. Even the filth was gone. The skin had also regained its soft, pale pink. All the fatigue and discomfort the man had suffered had been taken from him. The only thing that remained the same were the cracks that still covered his right arm. The man let out a soft sigh. His scarlet gaze then shifted in a random direction. Without looking at the red-haired man on the ground, he stood up and began to walk. The man hadn't even taken the second step when he disappeared behind the curtain of shadows. A few minutes after the strange man disappeared, rapid footsteps came from the back of the alley. Tap, 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 tap. The footsteps stopped when the person saw the body on the ground. After a few seconds of suspicion and nervous observation of the body, recognition shone in her blue eyes. Breathing heavily and with her heart on the verge of exploding, she moved quickly. In an exhausted sprint, the woman, now identified as a woman, knelt beside the unconscious body, now able to recognize the all-too familiar red hair. Mr. Kenway. Her hands went up to her mouth in horror, and she tried to turn the man over, but before her hands touched the body, she stopped. Experience with similar cases in the past stopped her. Perhaps there would be some internal injury, or he would have a broken neck. She had seen too many similar cases in her time in the cave where people tried to help but only ended up making the situation worse. Please, please, please. Something useful. The fear of aggravating an injury served to calm her fears. Looking around for something she could use, she despaired at the sight of nothing but rubbish. Then her eyes lit up with recognition, and she stood up quickly. Before she ran for the alley's exit, she looked at Adrian with determination. Please hold on, Mr. Kenway. I'll be back with help. Swearing on her soul, Serena Williams ran to the end of the alley with more speed than before. Dodging the overturned carriages and the large cracks in the ground, she raced towards the massive doors of the Golden Domed Church. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. The first thing he noticed when his consciousness returned was the smell. A smell that reminded him of home. It was one that he found hard to describe, but that was warming his insides and leaving his mind at peace. The second was the softness beneath him, his body resting on a mattress that felt like a white cloud had been fished out of the sky and tucked into sheets. For the briefest of moments, he thought he was back. He had returned to his simple bed in his world, and in a few moments, he would hear his mother's high-pitched voice shouting that breakfast was ready. He would come downstairs and see his mother, father, and brother eating breakfast at a table that was not meant for 4 people. As soon as that happy thought came, he crushed it. His eyes opened, and he looked up at the somewhat familiar wooden ceiling, not at all similar to the black beamed ceiling and red shingles of his room. Adrian stood for a few moments like that, staring silently at the ceiling without blinking, just staring at the ceiling with a serene gaze. After what was easily 10 minutes, he sat up in bed. The thin sheet that covered him slid down his bare chest until it rested in his lap, a simple pair of brown trousers covering it. His hair followed the sheet and fell across his forehead, covering his eyes and making all he could see red. He reached up with his left hand and brushed his hair off his forehead, noticing in passing that it had grown longer and shinier. Looking at his palm and arm, he noticed the same, smooth and soft skin, without any imperfections, and completely free of hair. He ran his soft hand over his chin and did not feel the early stubble. Letting out a soft sigh and lowering his left hand to his lap, he finally brought his attention to his right arm. From his right shoulder to his fingertips, the entire arm was wrapped in thick white bandages. This caused a delicate red eyebrow to raise slightly. Since he had regained consciousness, he had not felt the bandages. Without moving his arm, he looked at the rest of his body, lifting the sheet to see the underside. No wounds in sight, just healthy pale pink skin. It seemed that all the wounds he had suffered had healed. His lips pursed imperceptibly. The knowledge that his wounds had been healed brought him no comfort, only bitter memories. Returning his attention to the only part of his body that was bandaged, his left hand reached up and grabbed one of them, ready to see what was underneath. He didn't feel any pain in his arm, rather, he couldn't feel anything from his arm, so it should be okay to see a little bit of the damage. I wouldn't recommend that, princess. Unlike your body, your arm is not a very pleasant sight. His hand froze at the familiar voice, his eyebrows raising momentarily. Flora. Who else would it be? Your mum. How long have I been unconscious? Since I woke up with you in that alley. About 18 hours, it's now 8:26 in the morning on Friday the 17th of August. Honestly, I thought you'd be gone longer. I'd almost bet on that. Adrian took a few minutes to digest his companion's words. His brow furrowed slightly, his eyes in deep thought. How? It was just a word, a simple question, but it carried the great doubt that weighed the redhead down. Anyone else would have asked what he meant, failing to understand the question and asking for a more detailed explanation. Flora was not one of those people. She understood immediately what was the doubt that weighed on her redhead. So, with a slight sigh, she replied, I don't know, princess. After stealing the candy from that amorphous thing, I had to sleep for months to recover, not just a few minutes. I'm as much in the dark as you are on this. Giving a weak nod, Adrian looked at his bandaged arm for a few moments before sighing. Using that same arm, he pulled the sheet off his back and stood up. He then began to stretch his arms and body, to his surprise, finding that he felt no discomfort or fatigue. Something that caught his attention. Squinting his eyes in suspicion, Adrian approached the only table in the room. He then began to carefully unwrap his arm. Don't say I didn't warn you, Flora chirped in his ear, and Adrian could imagine a small worm rolling its eyes while wearing a silly painted-on grin. After a little while of undressing his arm, the redhead could finally see it naked with a simple expression. His eyes slightly closed and his lips pursed. At least this stayed, he mumbled as he turned and examined the bizarre scene in front of him. His arm had not changed since he last saw it. Huge, hairline black cracks completely covered the pale skin. Now that he could see better, they were more similar to spider webs than dry dirt. These cracks stretched all the way down his arm, from his shoulder to his fingertips, an eerie and sinister black web that caused shivers to run down his spine at the mere sight of it. Turning his hand over several times, clenching and unclenching his fist, twisting and wiggling his fingers. Adrian's expression only grew grimmer, something that caught the attention of Flora, who had been watching the scene curiously. And here I thought that when you woke up, you'd be screaming and crying in pain like a little nanite. But, of course, your pain tolerance is disgusting. I'm sure that's nothing more than a tickle to you. Flora finished with a giggle. If her arm looked half as bad as Adrian's, she's sure she'd be doing that and more. I don't feel a thing. Those words were like a bucket of cold water to the demi-goddess. What do you mean by that? You can move your arm. You must be able to feel it. Sigh. Shaking his head, Adrian began to wrap his arm back up skillfully but at a somewhat calm pace. Just because I can move it doesn't mean I can feel it. If I wasn't looking at it, I'd think I'd lost my arm, he said. This is the price of having abused the resurrection process. It's not as bad as I thought it would be. He could still use his arm, the only problem was that he couldn't feel it. Considering how useful it was. One arm is a con. Unable to help himself, a small chuckle escaped his lips. It only stunned and infuriated the Jacob more. What the fuck is wrong with you, Adrian? That's all you have to say. That it's just one arm. You're sick. Don't you realize what it means? You can no longer feel cold or heat, you can no longer feel the touch of a loved one, you can no longer feel the coolness of the water on a summer day. If it weren't for the fact that you can still move your arm, you would be one-armed. Adrian remained silent, letting his companion finish her part before saying anything. I can still grab, squeeze, punch, and throw. I may not even feel it's there, but I can still use it. Flora, think of the madness we did. That was none other than a mission of no return, death being the safest thing for us. That we not only survived but one was not by a miracle or the grace of the gods. It was by our cunning, wit, and tenacity. Because we were willing to sacrifice everything. Think of the lives we saved. We saved the world, Flora. My arm is insignificant compared to everything we accomplished. Besides, if I did nothing, the apocalypse would start, and then we'd be in trouble. No matter how you look at it, there was no other choice. Quote. A long, heavy silence filled his mind. Surely, Flora was processing his words, and he would give her space. Finally, after another 4 minutes, Flora spoke in a heavy, tired voice, a hint of sadness in every word. Quote. So you're going to tell me you're not upset at all? Adrian snorted and shook his head. Of course I am. If I hadn't missed my first core attack, I could still feel my arm. You could say this is the price I paid for missing the first time. Quote. How much more do you think you have to pay before the world is satisfied? If this happens again, what will you give up next time? Your other arm, or one of your legs? Engrave these words, Adrian Kenway, engrave them deep in your soul. Don't throw your life away so easily. When you lose your will to live and are willing to die to win, that's when you really lose yourself. Adrian found himself shocked for a few long moments. Flora's words hit deep inside him, a stab to the heart. His emotions flared for an instant, but he managed to barely contain them. He couldn't help but raise his lips into a fond smile. Recovering, Adrian let out a slight chuckle. I didn't know you were such a poet, Miss Worm. If you keep using your old lady charms, I'll fall in love with you in no time. Quote. This is not the time. Flora replied after a few seconds, a slight trace of embarrassment in her voice. It seemed she had realized that she had put more emotion and intensity into her previous speech than she wanted to. Hee. If you had a body, I'd give you a kiss on the forehead with how cute you are, you hardly even look like a fossil with your shyness. If she had a body, her cheeks would be red. Go eat dog shit, princess. It's wrong to tease a lady like that, you know. Footsteps reached his ears behind the closed door of the room, a mischievous idea popped into his mind, and a teasing smile was born on his face. Oh, but I'm not teasing Miss Worm, I may be teasing you a lot with your age, but let me tell you a little secret. Licking his lips and sensually squinting his eyes, Adrian slurred the words masterfully, sending shivers down the Jacob's spine. Using his spirituality, he heated his mouth, and a cloud of steam came out, accompanied by heavy breaths. I've always preferred my women to be older than me. Adrian, Flora exclaimed in complete embarrassment. The demi-goddess found her non-existent heart was about to burst. That was too much. Her mind was spinning. What a bloody misguided son of a. How dare he make her heart beat that fast? And she wasn't old. Yes, she may have been over 200 years old and older than Emperor Russell himself, but she was still young. She had been insulted again. Then why did it feel so good for him to say that? He did it again. Crash. Leaving his companion in her embarrassed ramble, Adrian turned calmly towards the wide-open door and the woman in the doorway who had tossed a tray with a cup of medicine and ground herbs onto the floor. Adrian greeted the crimson-eyed woman who had begun to cry, giving her a small smile. Hey, long time no see opera. You look good. Thick tears fell from the woman's red eyes, causing them to glisten slightly under the lamplight, giving an air of innocence. The woman blew her stuffy nose and put her hands to her face to try to wipe the tears away, but they wouldn't stop. Sniff ya sniff Adrian. Sniff, the woman cried loudly, frozen in place and trembling. Come here, little one. Shaking his head with a gentle smile, Adrian walked over to Opera and gave her a hug. Due to the height difference between the two, he wrapped his arms around her head. Opera didn't lag behind and wrapped her arms around his waist while still sinking her face into his chest. I was so scared, the woman sobbed, and Adrian merely stroked the planter's soft hair. It's all right. It's all right, I'm here. Adrian comforted with a sweet, gentle smile. The corners of his lips lifted slightly as rapid footsteps, some light and some heavy, came rushing towards them. Turning and looking at the frozen newcomers, Adrian gave them a toothy grin as he winked. What's up, brats? Did you miss me? Tap 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 tap. Pam. Wah. Looking down at the head of curly brown hair hugging his legs so tightly that her knuckles turned white, Adrian could only let out a giggle as he carefully stroked that hair. I'm happy, her hair is softer and smoother than last time. She must be eating and resting well. As if carrying his thoughts, Jerry raised her head and looked at him with reddened gray eyes and puffy cheeks. She looked like a little mouse with full cheeks. At such a tender image, Adrian could only smile apologetically. I'm sorry to have worried you so much. You better. Jerry murmured as she sank her face back into her hero's leg and let him continue to stroke her head gently. Looking up at the last three remaining, Adrian winked at them. Well, won't you join in the embrace? Not even in your dreams, boss. Charlotte grunted as he walked up to Adrian and slapped him hard on the back. Ignoring the sting in his hand and swallowing his groan of pain, the young man gave a small smile to his leader. Welcome back. Winking at the young man, Adrian turned to look at pugilist Sasha, who had moved to stand in front of them. She had a serious look in her green eyes. But to Adrian and Charlotte, who knew her, both could see that glint of mischief. For that very reason Charlotte tried to escape, but the giant's muscular arm was quicker. Adrian, for his part, let himself be grabbed with a sideways grin. Pulling the quartet to her chest in a powerful bear hug, Sasha let out a loud cry of joy accompanied by a laugh, small tears streaming down her eyes. I was so worried, Captain. Don't ever scare us like that again. With each word, she tightened her embrace but was always careful not to hurt the little ones. Adrian laughed at Sasha's words and gave a toothy smile. And miss a good dance? Nah, the red-haired man replied dismissively as his scarlet eyes moved to the end of the hallway where a figure was watching the whole thing half hidden. He had heard her earlier but hadn't commented. Oh, what is she doing here? Recognizing the figure, his eyes moved questioningly to Father, who understood the message and gave a discreet nod. Letting out a grunt, Sasha continued the embrace for a further 15 seconds before blurting out, always like that, Captain. You're crazy, you know. And you love me for that, was the red-haired man's short reply. Father Yutravsky looked at him calmly, his expression showing no change except for the gentle little grandfatherly smile. The mountain of a man extended a clenched fist towards him. Blessed be Mother Earth that you were able to return safe and sound, Mr. Kenway. Raising his left arm, the conspirator bumped fists with the giant with a sideways smile. Thanks for taking care of me, very nice beds, by the way. I almost didn't want to get up. Ads by PubFuture. The big father smiled at the red-haired man and nodded. Would you like something to eat, Mr. Kenway? We were just about to have Miss Opera's breakfast. Or you can go back to rest if you like, and we'll talk when you wake up. I'll have breakfast, Father. I haven't eaten in days, so you better watch your plates, as I will have no shame in stealing your food. Adrian commented with a wink. His nearly empty stomach could fit a horse if he put his mind to it. Opera chose that moment to finally detach herself from the redhead's shoulder. She looked embarrassed as she had soiled the shoulder with her tears and some snot, but even after the redhead's words, who didn't make a big deal of it, she still looked very embarrassed. Breakfast is scrambled eggs and coffee. Thanks to Miss Sasha always asking for seconds, I usually make more than we need, so there should be plenty for you, Opera said somewhat sheepishly as she grabbed a broomstick from the room and began to clean up the plate she had broken earlier. Hey, just so you know, what I eat is completely normal. Sasha defended herself somewhat indignantly. You eat like you're going to die the next day, Sasha. Don't deny it. Adrian commented nonchalantly as he used a rag given to him by Charlotte to wipe his dirty shoulder. Sasha's expression grew even more indignant, and she placed a hand on her chest as if she had been injustice slapped. Captain. Thank you, by the way. Here, thanking the Malay scholar for the rag and handing it to the aforementioned, Adrian ignored the giantess, drama. Don't worry, boss. With some disgust, the young man grabbed the rag with his fingertips and disappeared into the hallway to go wash it. Smiling at the retreating man, Adrian returned his attention to the mountain in front of him. Hey, father. Bathroom's free, isn't it? I'd like to take a shower before eating. Glancing for a few seconds at the red-haired man, Yutravsky gave a slight nod. Go ahead, Mr. Kenway. The bathroom is stocked with hot water, soap, shampoo, and fresh towels. I'll bring you a change of clothes while you use it. The bathroom is down the hall, last door on the right. Smiling at the father, Adrian nodded. I appreciate it. Sorry for the inconvenience. Shaking his head gently, father looked into the shorter man's scarlet eyes earnestly. It's the least I can do after what you did. Oh, so you've already given a report on that? Yutravsky nodded. I received the official report a few hours ago. The report that was given to the public was different. Nodding at his words, Adrian looked down from the father's eyes to the hair still hugging his leg. Jerry, can you please let go? The redhead gently asked as he gently stroked the girl's hair. After a few seconds, and reluctantly, the youngest in the group let go of her hero's leg. Her head lowered as she looked down at the ground. Letting out a soft sigh, Adrian knelt on one leg and placed both hands on the little girl's shoulders. I'll be right with you for breakfast. Why don't you save me a place by your side, and in return, I'll tell you what I saw while I was out. How about that? At such a proposition, Jerry's head went up in a blur, and the little girl's gray eyes sparkled with excitement. Deal. Turning around, the half-spectator ran and disappeared down the hall towards the kitchen, being closely followed by Sasha. Opera followed them as soon as she finished placing the broken pottery in the trash can to prepare the extra plate. The red-haired man watched as they both left, the cloaked figure disappearing as soon as they crossed the corner. He could hear them talking, but that was not the focus of his attention. Alone now, both men looked into each other's eyes. The first to break the silence was Adrian. How did I end up here? A young lady found you in an alley 2 streets away from the church, and it was she herself who notified us that you were there. She had the sharp mind to separate one of us to tell us in private. Sasha was the one who brought you here through the back door while Opera treated your arm. I had no other injuries, nor was I with someone else. You were in perfect health. The only wound we found was the one on your arm that no matter how many times we tried, we couldn't treat it. And you were alone when we found you. I don't hear anyone else in the church. Where are all the wounded? The more serious ones were taken to hospitals to get better help while the healthier ones went back to their homes to check the damage. The rest were taken to bigger churches because we lack the capacity to treat them accordingly. I should have had a jet stone with me when you found me. They are the characteristics of a devil I killed. Where is it? At the sudden information, father paused his quick reply and looked for a few seconds at the red-haired man. His eyebrows slightly raised in surprise at his revelation. After a few seconds, the man spoke. Quote. When Sasha went to retrieve you, she also found the stone, but she had no means to seal it, so she took it away from you. I went to retrieve it when she told me about it and sealed it in a small container. I will deliver it to you along with your clothes in the bathroom. Is there anything I need to be aware of or anything I should know? Instead of answering, the father reached into his robe, pulled something out of it, and handed it to the red-haired man. I wouldn't go outside the church if I were you. Squinting, Adrian took the object, a newspaper, and read the front page. His eyes widened slightly, and he couldn't help but squeeze the paper tighter, crumpling it. That's quite a few zeros. Flora commented in a bit of a daze, looking at the issue that carried almost the entire front page. Processing what he was reading, Adrian let out a soundless sigh, folded the paper, and looked with a raised eyebrow at his father. You wouldn't happen to have any red poppies and red candles I could borrow, would you? I like to bathe with some ambiance and would prefer to be comfortable in my first shower in days. This was an Earth Mother church, and it wouldn't be too crazy for them to possess those flowers. Besides that, Opera is a planter. I'm sure they have a garden somewhere. Adrian thought calmly as the father looked at him as if he had sprouted multiple heads. After a few seconds, Yutravsky finally recovered. I'll bring them to you in a moment. Yep. Secret garden. A while later, after locking the bathroom door and placing the folded clothes, small container, flowers, and candles on top of the toilet, Adrian stood in the middle of the medium-sized bathroom with the newspaper in his bandaged hand. The day before, Backland was rocked by a huge explosion and an earthquake that shook the city's very foundations and almost brought it to its feet. Recent investigations show that the earthquake was caused by the same explosion that could be heard for miles. The explosion was caused by a fire at a gasworks in East Borough. Because it could not be controlled in time, the fire caused a chain reaction that ignited multiple tons of gas in a huge explosion. The explosion left a horrific chemical fire that stretched for miles and reached high into the sky. The plumes of toxic reddish smoke caused some people to say it was as if a huge crimson tree appeared from the ground. The toxic smoke generated a horrible storm that covered Backland, making it seem as if night had suddenly fallen. The storm lasted all night, and the rain helped prevent the fire from spreading. The fumes released by the explosion were not only extremely toxic, causing horrific injuries to people, but the fumes acted as a drug, causing those closest to the source of the explosion to lose all sense and show enormous levels of aggression. There are great rumors of flying men and lightning, but all the people who said they saw this were close to the explosion, so it is quite possible that they were just hallucinations caused by the toxic fumes. The loss not only of property but of life due to this event is like no disaster seen before in modern times. The damage sustained due to this horrific event is estimated to be well in excess of hundreds of billions of pounds, while the confirmed loss of life so far is 164,000 people. Due to the enormous damage sustained, the poor documentation of the East Borough population, and the fact that as you read this newspaper, bodies are still being counted and recovered. The death toll is estimated to be close to 1 million. But there is a strong rumor that is under investigation but worth mentioning. The explosion was not an accident but a terrorist attack by an evil organization. There are multiple sightings of mysterious people confronting the police and causing even more damage, and not only that. After several days missing and presumed dead, the fire mage reappeared and confronted these people. The eyewitness accounts of the fight are so fanciful that it is hard to believe even if they are false or exaggerations, but it is obvious that it was a fight for the history books. As a result of those who witnessed the fight, which is not a small number, the name Fire Mage has been dropped from the title that has been used to refer to the hero of East Borough. People now call him the White Dragon Knight of East Borough. As if that wasn't enough, the bounty on Adrian Kenway has been increased to go with his new title as if it were a badge of honor. For anyone who delivers Adrian Kenway, dead or alive, to any of the 3 churches, a juicy reward of £50,000 will be given. Any useful information on his whereabouts will also be handsomely rewarded, with a minimum of £2,000. Sigh. Putting the newspaper down and placing it on the sink, Adrian put a hand to his face and grunted. "We did what we could, Princess." Flora comforted in a soft, calm voice. Nodding slightly at his companion's words, Adrian sighed again and lowered his hand. His eyes had become 2 soul-deep icebergs. Shaking his head, he nodded. "I know." Looking at himself in the bathroom mirror, Adrian couldn't help but notice his changes better. His eyes had sharpened slightly and now sparkled with a sensual glow. His lips filled out a little more, and his facial features became more handsome and beautiful. To his relief, his chest did not grow, but he could notice how his figure looked much more aesthetic and pleasing to the eye. Out of a feeling, he turned around and looked at his rear. His expression broke a little, and a small blush covered him. "Oh, that's big." And not to mention his legs, even under his trousers, he could proudly say. Any woman would kill to have those legs. Shaking his head, he put those thoughts aside and returned his attention to what he was going to do. Flora was abnormally quiet, the demi-goddess finally getting a better look at the redhead after his promotion and rest and not being able to help but be speechless. How hot is this guy going to get? Opening his mouth as wide as he could and sticking out his thick pink tongue that now easily reached under his chin, to the surprise and delight of a certain worm, Adrian slipped his fingers into his mouth. Invisible threads ran down his throat to his stomach, and having found their target, they began to pull it up. Pulling the object out of his mouth, which was now covered in his saliva. Adrian lit his hand on fire, cleansing it before washing it in the sink. With Talk Millennium now out of his stomach, he set it aside. He grabbed the candles and flowers and began to prepare to do the ritual sacrifice. "Are you really going to do this in a church? Wouldn't that be dangerous?" Flora asked, watching what her redhead was doing, curiosity creeping into her tone. "No problem. It'll be quick," Adrian commented seriously as he knelt on the ground and clasped his hands together in prayer. Besides, he couldn't wait any longer. He had to get into the City of Calamities quickly to not only think about the next course of action but also everything he learned these past few days. The Scarlet Monarch that burns depravity. The calamity of the old days. The closest to the oldest one. With the incantations done and whispers reaching his ears, Adrian quickly began to draw the sphere of light in his mind to enter the Sephira. Redrawing it again and again, he could already see the smoke-covered city in the distance when suddenly his spirituality flared, and he was pulled out of the state of cogitation. Adrian, please tell me you forgot you had it with you. His companion's alarmed voice instantly sharpened his senses. Dazed and following the guidance of his spirituality, Adrian looked down at his left bicep, and his eyes froze. Since when can that thing do that? It came out of your shadow like a cockroach. Flora asked cautiously, watching what was unfolding. There, shrouded just as the last time he had seen it, was a black band that seemed to be made of the same shadows, dancing in a wind not present. The burnt band. That's impossible. It's supposed to be destroyed. What the fuck is it doing here? Despite his shock and disbelief, Adrian didn't waste a second and quickly tried to stake the band off his arm. This was a dangerous situation. He had to get rid of that thing now. No sooner had his hand grasped it, and noticing how cold it felt to the touch, the band made of shadows slipped out of Adrian's bicep, through his fingers, and hit the ground with a wet sound. The red-haired man stared dazedly at the patch of shadows that looked like a demon had vomited darkness directly onto the ground. Before he could try to escape from the bathroom, the blob of darkness literally spat out several objects that fell at the feet of the man, who had his mouth half open. The first object to be expelled was a wine-colored glove, whose entire body was covered with theatrical masks whose expressions were of pure horror. Ads by PubFuture. The second object was also a glove, but unlike the first one, this one seemed to be made of human skin and had a mouth full of sharp teeth in the palm that was smiling enormously, clearly very happy. Vecchio Pomodoro in creeping hunger. What the? Adrian found himself speechless. What the fuck was going on? Finally, the blob of darkness spat out a third object that also fell at Adrian's feet. As soon as this object left the blob, it began to boil and bubble as it shrunk. After a few seconds, the blob resumed the shape of the burnt band but retained the appearance of shadows moving in the invisible wind. But Adrian did not notice the change the burnt band underwent, for all his attention was on the third and final object it had spat out. Adrian's face froze, his mouth half open, and his eyes widened in shock. Flora within herself was the same as she recognized the object at the redhead's feet. Is that a? Flora asked in a daze. Unable to complete the question because of the unbelievable sight in front of her. Snapping out of his stupor, Adrian let out a shaky sigh and nodded as he grabbed the last object with his threads and brought it to his hand. Yep. Adrian, you lucky bastard. Flora exclaimed euphorically, trembling with excitement. What the red-haired man held in his hands was a treasure trove of legends. I thought they were lies, but they're real. Oh shit, they really exist. Resting in the redhead's left hand was a card. On the face of this card was an illustration of a man with a good mustache hanging upside down on an inverted cross. He was tied with a rope by his wrists to the arms of the cross while both feet were tied to the pole of it. The shadow cast by the hanging man seemed to have countless eyes staring at him. Despite his position, the hanged man had a calm gaze. Adrian instantly recognized the man on the card, not only because he was one of the most important figures in the history of this world, but because of his enormous importance in the original story. Emperor Russell Gustav. On the top left of the hanging Russell, a line of text written in words as bright as stars read, Sequence 0, the hanged man. It was a card of blasphemy. Every question in the red-haired man's mind about what had happened was answered the instant he saw this card. What are you waiting for? Open it. I want to read it. Flora exclaimed. A girl with 10 kilos of sugar in her blood wouldn't be half as excited as the Jacob was right now. She always tried to find a card of blasphemy but could never find one even after searching for a whole century. The cryptologist in her was elated. Now that she had one in front of her, she couldn't miss the chance. Please hurry. No. What? Flora was about to protest with sticks and torches. This was an injustice. This is a business where we have no place. Adrian replied serenely as he knelt down. Understood. The torches were extinguished and put away in the cupboard. Her desire to read a card of blasphemy may be huge, but her desire to live was far greater. Stay out of God's business. Placing all the objects on the altar, Adrian folded his hands and resumed praying. Closing the fire door and looking at the items in front of him, Adrian simply sent Creeping Hunger, Talk Millennium, Burnt Band, and Vecchio Pomodoro with the remaining artifacts as he sent the container with Joseph's characteristics with the other characteristics he had. The only thing left floating in front of him was the card of blasphemy. Letting out a sigh, he put a hand to his forehead to try to calm the headache he was now feeling. Now he had a name for the one who had healed his wounds and healed Flora, as he finally understood what Hunter's Hallow had said. So the one who beat it was you, huh? TCH. He already had the idea that the rapper was aware of him, but not to the point of placing a lifeline and mark on the burnt band. You got that much confidence in me. I'm sure you gave me the ingredients for Provoker as a small investment, but how do you go from delivering sequence 8 ingredients to delivering a card of blasphemy? You're crazy. I'm sure of that. That doesn't seem to have changed. But just because you're crazy doesn't mean you're stupid. If anything remained after your death, it's your way of paying. You also have an equivalent form of exchange, a sick form but equivalent too. So there are two possibilities. I will give you something in the future, or I already gave you something. In the future, it is unlikely that this will be the case. You may be the best candidate for that throne, and I have no problem with you possessing it, but it's too early for that. You haven't been resurrected yet, so there has to be something else. That means it's more likely to be the second choice. I already gave something, and the card of blasphemy was my payment, but what could I give that would mean such a special payment? Letting out a heavy sigh, the conspirator's mind sped up, mixing and filtering the information quickly. The red-haired man's eyebrows shot upwards. That's it. Running a hand through his hair, Adrian manifested a beach chair and sat down, his legs failing him for a moment. If things didn't change too much, Lenevis would be forced to come to Backland and fall into the hands of the Aurora Order, which planned to use him to create a vessel for the descent of the Rapper. They would do that through a ritual using the suffering, corruption, degeneracy, and death of the East Borough with the help of the Trap Club, who unleashed a plague on the borough, causing more pain and fueling the ritual. Of course, things went wrong early on because Lenevis died at the hands of Klein, and Mr. A offered himself as the new vessel before the poor god stuck his nose and also destroyed that too. Sure, but that's in the original story. In this present, I'm sure Lenevis was still alive when the shit hit the fan. That means that during yesterday's whole mess, the Aurora Order was able to use the disaster to complete the ritual, and with no one to stop them, they were able to successfully create a vessel for the Rapper. Adrian let out a loud grunt and covered his face with both hands. Fuck. A vessel for the descent of a god was now walking free in the world. Sighing, Adrian leaned back in the beach chair and watched the yellowish clouds roll past. But even with that in mind, I wasn't directly involved in the whole process. The red-haired man muttered and then frowned slightly. It might have been because I stopped the destruction of Backland. Yes, that was it. He may be willing to kill large numbers of innocent people in order to gain the upper hand, but for all the madness that chokes him, the Rapper was always on the side of Earth. He would never allow the divine horde to descend, so if I failed to deal with the baby, I'm sure he would have acted and ended it. But of course, that would mean revealing that he can now walk the world and considering the amount of gods that were watching everything that happened in the tree. Even someone like him wouldn't have managed to escape the attack that would fall. Considering the hatred the troublesome pigeon and the Rapper have for each other, I doubt he wouldn't have released the energy to destroy Backland to eliminate him. He would have even gained help from the plucky bird and the bearded lizard. Backland would have been leveled, and his vessel would have been destroyed. If I look at it that way, not only did I keep his vessel from being destroyed, but thanks to me dealing with the baby, his status is still a secret. With all that in mind, paying with the card of blasphemy made a lot more sense. Of course, he couldn't rule out that it was also a heavier form of investment. But there were also several questions that it raised. The biggest of all, how did he manage to heal Flora? Hunter's Hallow protects her in a certain way and hides her. Is the limit of the robe the gods? No. It has to be something else. Hunter's Hallow managed to save me from the vessel of the Evernight gods. Sighing, Adrian began to tap the armrest of the beach chair as he struck a thoughtful pose. There's still too much I don't know about Hunter's Hallow. This will have to wait. His finger tapped the armrest in a small rhythm. Doubts and more doubts filled his mind. Evernight attacked me. It may have been to get the tunic. After all, it's made from the water of the river of eternal darkness. TCH, that's why she found me so quickly. I'm sure she followed the law of attraction to me. But if she could do that, why didn't she come for me when I was unconscious? I would have been practically served on a silver plate to her. Did Hunter's Hallow do something that made it hard for her to track me, or is something else? Clicking his tongue again, Adrian finally decided to leave the subject of Hunter's Hallow for another time. There was still too much he didn't know, so it would just be a waste of time to dwell on it. His mind instead went to the more important topic. Rose school of thought. They are different from the original story. Adrian narrowed his eyes. In the original story, while the Beyonders on the Divine Whore's side were welcome, they were not given important roles and were even looked down upon. The Doctor being such an important part of the organization and being a Beyonder on the Divine Whore's side shows the difference. Whatever path the Doctor was part of, Adrian was sure it was on that bitch's side. Both gave him a similar feeling and possessed similar skills. This time, the Divine Whore and the overdeveloped Shrub are not divorced and have a better relationship. And not only that, the Rose School knows that I'm not from this world. How much they know is beyond me, but that they know more than me about my status is sure. And if the Rose School knows that, then the ones outside know for sure, too. This could also mean that there is a high chance that the gods also know about his alien status. TCH. How annoying. Not only that, but the Rose School seems to have a way of tracking me. It doesn't seem to be a GPS type. If it was, they would have found me a lot quicker. It's possible that a compass would be more comfortable. I can't stay in one place anymore. I have to be always moving to drive that compass crazy. Watching the clouds pass by, Adrian let out a sigh, extended his hand towards the sky and clenched his fist. Backland is no longer safe. I have to get the hell out of here. That was the most obvious move. The Rose School already knew he was here, the gods knew he was here, he had to move. I already got everything I wanted by coming to Backland. He more than fulfilled the goals he committed to before he had to left the city. 1. Obtain Beyonder's powers and reach sequence 6. 2. Obtain at least 40.000 pounds. 3. Obtain various sealed artifacts and potion formulas. 4. Find a way to obtain a messenger. He had committed to that and achieved it with flying colors. The fact that he had already started forming a team on the way was an addition. Sighing, Adrian began to tap harder on the armrest. There's still a problem. The bounty on his head. With that kind of price on my head, everyone is my enemy. Every self-respecting secret organization will notify their members to keep an eye out for me. With me being alone, as far as they know, I'd just be easy prey. Hiding from one secret organization is easy. But all of them, even with Hunter's Hallow and Creeping Hunger's help, it would only be a matter of time before they catch me again. I need a shield, a large figure over my shoulder that will make them think twice before they think of hunting me. The only thing that can generate such a large shadow is a plan formed in his mind. A plan that, even by his books, was completely insane. And that was just what he needed. Letting out a long sigh, Adrian gave a resigned smile. Well, it was a matter of time, after all. Sooner or later, it was going to end up happening. Why not take the band-aid off now? Nodding inwardly, the sphere of light drew in his mind, and he disappeared from the city. He would read the card of blasphemy later, he couldn't lose any more precious time. Returning to his body, Adrian set aside the candles and flowers and placed the bell to one side. After that, he knelt down again and prayed. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. Potato Street, Unit 3-6, Lemberg. Klein Moretti lifted the teacup to his lips and took a small sip. The clown let out a soft sigh as, with his free hand, he scratched his cheek, where the beginnings of a beard were visible. The rent for this flat is 8 gold sasam at the 15th of every month. I still have 112 gold sasam left. Assuming my expenses on food and accessories, I can last about 9 months. Of course, if I count mystical materials for rituals and potions, it will only last a maximum of 2 if I manage to stretch my expenses. Letting out a heavy sigh, the clown lowered the cup carefully to his plate and scratched his head in frustration. Next to his food were some documents. Those documents were his new identity. It had cost him more than half his money just to buy these. This contained all the basic information, such as his place and date of birth, education and occupation, etc. The information it has is quite good, and its quality is considerable. Even if I undergo a little research, it won't show anything unusual. Klein had divined about that in space on the gray fog, and the result had been quite favorable, so he was safe for the current time. Shaking his head, his eyes moved for a moment to his new name, and he couldn't help but feel highly embarrassed. Ever since he had heard the name James Holmes, he had not been able to help but relate the persona of Mr. Chariot to those of his world. Klein thought it would be poetic to take a page from the man's book, considering that he had come to Lemberg to investigate and become stronger. Besides, if there is another transmigrator in the present time, the name is sure to make them curious and make contact. This way, it will be much easier to find more companions, and together, we can look for a way to return. Since he had read in Emperor Russell's diary that there was a transmigrator even older than him, Klein knew there should be more. Of course, he knew it was just a wish on a starless night. If the pattern of transmigrators repeated itself, the one after him wouldn't fall for at least another 50 years if he went by the time reduction between him, Russell, and the unknown transmigrator. He doubted he would have to stay in this world for 50 years, he believed he should be able to escape without needing that time. But of course, if another time reduction is great as with Mr. Anonymous, Emperor Russell, and finally me happens. It wouldn't be crazy if the next transmigrator falls this year or has already fallen. That my name is so recognizable to them will mean that if they are around, they will come for me. Klein was sure that the name of his new identity would be enough to catch the attention of any modern person. It was one of popular culture, after all. Sherlock Moriarty, hey. Letting out a small chuckle at that, which died after a few seconds, Klein let out a heavy sigh as he closed his eyes in thought. Sure, I just hope they're as good as Emperor Russell was. I don't know anything about Mr. Anonymous, but I would like to believe they weren't a bad person. And if I add me to the equation, chances are the next transmigrator will be someone at least decent. But if Klein was honest, even if the new transmigrator was a bit of a piece of work, he was sure he could handle it. I have dealt with Mr. Chariot and seen what he can do. It doesn't matter if the other transmigrator is a bit annoying, they can't be as bad as Chariot. Shaking his head, Klein grabbed his cup and took a slow sip, feeling the smooth, slightly sour lemon tea. He could only sigh as he looked at the lime-green liquid. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The sudden whispers that reached his ears startled Klein a little before his eyes widened in recognition. That voice. Wasting no time, Klein shot up from his chair, almost knocking it to the floor. Abandoning his breakfast, he ran to the flat's bathroom and locked the door. Quickly but carefully, he erected a wall of spirituality sealing the bathroom. With that in place, he performed the incantations as he took the 4 steps. Finally, he sat on the toilet and closed his eyes. Returning to the mysterious space above the gray fog and in his seat of honor, no sooner had the clown entered than his eyes moved to the solitary crimson-stained flame. A smile grew on his face as he saw how it was pulsating. Mr. Chariot, he's all right. Sigh. A huge, soul-cleansing sigh left his body, immediately making him feel much better and lighter. Shaking his head and regaining his composure, Klein quickly controlled his expression with his clown skills and extended his hand toward the flame. It expanded, and he looked away from the kneeling monster and focused more on the room he was in. As that, a bathroom, Klein thought something curious. It seemed that the safest place to contact mysterious entities, even on the level of someone like Chariot, was the bathroom. Putting those thoughts aside, he focused his attention on what he was saying. Mr. Fool, I'd like to schedule an important meeting with you. It's about a deal that I'm sure will be of great interest to you. Whatever control the clown was having over his expression broke at the same time as the joy that Chariot was okay. His mouth dropped to the point where it seemed to break, and his eyes widened exaggeratedly. It was the comical expression of a clown in shock. Of all the things he had expected to hear, that was not one of them. Klein's breathing quickened, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. The leader of the tarot club sank into his chair of honor as he covered his forehead with one hand. Unbeknownst to him, his free hand began to anxiously tap the edge of the bronze table. Tap 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 tap. This guy wants a private audience with me. Did he finally get to find out the truth about me and is furious with me for ripping him off? He's going to cut my head off for sure. What do I do? Run away and hide? No, that wouldn't work. Chariot would end up finding me, I'm sure. And if I try to? No, that would be worse. He killed Kilongos and managed to escape from whoever kidnapped him. What chance do I, a little sequence 8, have? Klein panted for a good few moments before a fleeting thought struck him. Chariot had asked for a private meeting to discuss a deal that would benefit him, the fool. There is no evidence that Mr. Chariot knows that the fool is actually a poor sequence 8 Beyander. If he did, he wouldn't be talking about making deals with me. It would be like a millionaire offering a homeless man the chance to be county CO. Impossible. Letting out a long, shuddering sigh, Klein scratched his cheek, somewhat embarrassed by his episode. Being alone now and without any form of protection had made him a scarier, more frightening, wounded cat. If he were still in Tingen, he wouldn't be so frightened. Sigh. But I'm not in Tingen anymore. Klein muttered bitterly with his eyes glazed over. Knowing that he was already wasting a lot of time, the clown went into cogitation and controlled his emotions. Now calmer, he settled back into the chair of honor. Satisfied with his position, he extended his spirituality and spoke in a calm, uninterested voice. Well, I'll listen to your proposition. Are you in a safe place, or is there a time you want to make the meeting? His identity as the fool did not have to include showing interest in deals proposed by the club's lesser members. That would have tarnished his image somewhat, but hearing about them was well within the role. Chariot's response took no time at all, as the man practically responded instantly. It's all right now, Mr. Fool, if it's all right with you. Let's see what Chariot wants, the clown thought to himself as he used the flame connection to summon the man's spirit body into space with him. The crimson flame spread, and the next moment, the strongest member of the Tarot Club had returned to his place. Good morning, Mr. Fool. Thank you very much for listening to my proposal. Rising, Adrian gave an elegant bow as he placed his hand over his heart. His voice had that slightly dark and provocative tone that he was known for in meetings. No problem, it's good to see you healthy, Mr. Chariot. I hear you were in a bit of trouble. Klein commented calmly. The corners of his lips quivered slightly, and the fog covering his face became a little thicker. No sooner had the man spoken than his spirituality had shot up in warning. Returning to his seat, Adrian looked earnestly at the covered Klein. Any trace of bullying and provocation was gone, and only a seriousness remained that made Klein almost straighten his back. Were it not for the fact that he was controlling his body with his abilities, it was certain he would have done so. Without giving Klein time to respond, Adrian said, I want to use all my contribution points. Klein's blood froze. The day he had feared most had come, and now was the time to pay. I knew it. You are a loan shark. You wait until the worst time to take what you gave in, good fortune, to take everything from the bastard you helped. Klein cursed with all his might deep in his heart. Again, his clown powers were used at full strength to prevent his body from showing any reaction. Taking a second to respond, Klein gave a slight nod. All right. What is your wish, Mr. Kenway? Following the code of equivalent exchange, I will do my best to deliver what you desire. Can I get you a cup of tea and a biscuit? Adding the last in his heart. Klein wanted so badly to bang his head against the bronze table until he suffered brain damage. The amount of contribution points Chariot had was ridiculous. The mere fact that he not only warned him about Ins Zangwill's plan when he had no business doing so, but was also providing key information meant that no matter what Klein could offer, it would surely be insufficient. I only have 100 pounds in my pocket now. With his heart pounding with pain, Klein anxiously awaited the dreaded request that Chariot had. What is it that I wish for? Oh, my dear Klein, you're going to hate me for this, but it's not time yet. Keeping the corners of his lips from lifting, Adrian gave a slight nod of his head. Of course, Mr. Fool, you are fair and benevolent. I'm sure you'll do your best to repay my effort. Klein's body didn't react. He remained just as calm and composed as ever, but Adrian was sure that inside him, the man had jumped. But before I use my contribution points, I'd like to talk about the deal I want to offer you. Having forgotten for a moment the original reason he had gone up to the man, Klein took a moment to respond. Why do you always change the gear of your assault? You may maintain your respect for me, but I'm sure you do it on purpose. Holding back the urge to hang the man, Klein nodded serenely. Go ahead. Without missing a beat, Adrian set his survival plan in motion. As you may be aware, I am a member of the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, but I do not believe in him. I am only in the church for my own convenience. When the time comes, I will have no problem in leaving it, for my allegiance and faith is not with that God. I am sure you are already aware of who I believe in, and that is why you have allowed me the honor of joining the Tarot Club. I follow and believe in an ancient God, an entity that is older than the current gods and has only recently awakened to claim its place. I only follow and believe in the Scarlet Monarch. And as his blessed, I spread his word and will wherever I go. It is for this very reason that I bring a message from him to you. My Lord wishes to make a deal with you. Single quote. Single quote. The gears in Klein's brain stopped working at such a revelation that his breathing stopped for an instant. A huge void formed in the clown's stomach that only continued to grow. Using all his will and making a tyrannical effort, Klein managed to stop his body from trembling in terror. He simply froze his body in place, making the gray fog that surrounded him look eerie and mysterious. What the fuck, Chariot? What the actual fuck is wrong with you? Klein roared furiously in his mind. His fists pounded furiously at a mental image of a red-haired man with horns and a red tail who was laughing like a madman despite the blows he was taking. Why can't you ever say anything normal? Does all the shit that comes out of your mouth have to be about a disaster or an unknown god? Klein was sure his heart stopped for several seconds at that revelation. All this time, he had the follower of an evil god inside the Tarot Club, and to top it off, he was the blessed. And not only did this god know about the club that should be a secret, but he also knew about him. For an instant, Klein almost severed the connection with Chariot but managed to stop himself in time. A fleeting question flashed through his mind, halting his action. If Adrian Kenway was the follower of an evil god, then why had he helped the people of East Borough so much? And not only that, according to everything he read, he had never spread the word of this god. Not to mention how he had helped him and the Tarot Club. His actions were not in keeping with what one would expect from the blessed one of an evil god. Tap 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 tap. The air on the musty bronze table became thick and suffocating. A huge pressure descended on the shoulders of those present. Klein said nothing, just continued to tap the edge of the bronze table as he considered what Chariot had said with a cooler mind. From the way he talks, he doesn't seem to be aware that in reality, the fool is nothing more than a weak meander of low sequence. If what Chariot said about his Lord is true, then he should be aware of that. Klein briefly considered that it was because the Scarlet Monarch himself was unaware of it, but he quickly dismissed that possibility. If I knew less, I would believe that, but thanks to Chariot's slip, I know better. Chariot thinks I am the missing ancestor of the Antigonus family, the half-fool. Being the blessed of a god, it is obvious that he knows a lot about the history of this world. But he doesn't know everything. I know that information is dangerous in this world. Chariot may be strong, but he is only a demigod. I'm sure the information he receives from the Scarlet Monarch is not complete enough to protect him. But the Scarlet Monarch doesn't have that problem. Being an elder god, I'm sure he knows the truth about what happened to the ancestor of the Antigonus family. He doubted that someone as supposed as an elder god would fall so easily for the latter's lie. It is certain that the first time I brought Adrian Kenway here, it was a surprise he was not expecting. His reaction confirms that to me, so for him, it was also a surprise. I'm sure when he told his lord about it, he immediately found the problem but decided not to say anything. Why? If Adrian Kenway is the blessed of the Scarlet Monarch, then why wouldn't he be aware of the truth? A fleeting thought crossed Klein's mind and he had to control his expression from changing. Could it be an investment? But why would an old god be interested in him? The answer was literally in front of him. In the thick fog that reached beyond what he could see. The mysterious space above the gray fog. This space. Surely the Scarlet Monarch knows what it is. That's why he decided to keep my true level hidden and let Chariot continue to believe that I am the ancestor. And if that old god knew about this space that Klein believed was related to his transmigration to this world and that he was important enough to invest in it. Tap 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 tap. The tapping at the bronze table stopped. The air seemed to freeze, and Klein gained an aura of calm and serenity. What's the deal? Despite the danger this could lead to, this was the first clue he had in being able to find a way home. he couldn't throw it away because he was afraid. If Klein could see inside Adrian, unlike the calm, respectful man on the outside, he would see a grinning monster. Controlling the corners of his mouth, Adrian gave a slight nod and began his plan. My lord wishes to use your name and that of the Tarot Club in order to protect me. Protect you. You, Mr. Chariot, the only person who would need protection would be the one who goes after you. Klein wasn't expecting that start but controlled himself and let the man continue. The state of my lord is not good. Even though thousands of years have passed, he is still recovering, so he will not be able to protect me from the greater threats that will come for me. His followers are also scarce. So far, I am the strongest there is, and even with that, I will be unable to protect myself. Little fellow, I'm only sequence 8, if there's a threat that neither you nor the Scarlet Monarch can deal with. How am I supposed to do it, eh? Klein was incredulous. The Scarlet Monarch was supposed to know his true level. Then why was he offering him an impossible job? Had he thought wrong? Was he still unknown? After purposely pausing for 10 seconds, Adrian continued as he controlled his face for a smile to emerge. Of course, my lord also knows that your condition is not much different from his. He doesn't want you to protect me in the conventional sense. My lord only wishes to be able to use your name and that of the Tarot Club to create a shield for me. The deal is that you allow the Tarot Club to be revealed to the world along with the existence of the Fool at the same time as the he is presented as one of the leaders of the organization on the same level as you. No sooner had he said that than Adrian immediately added, of course, my lord has no desire or intention to lead or participate in the Tarot Club. He only wishes to use the name to protect me and make the threats behind me think twice before attacking. Ads by PubFuture. This will only be until I become strong enough to be able to protect myself. Once that happens, you can reveal that the Scarlet Monarch is not part of the Tarot Club and only used the organization to protect me. At that point, it won't matter. No sooner had the red-haired man said what the Scarlet Monarch wanted than Klein felt his heart stop again and then almost immediately start beating again. Without missing a beat of his racing heart, Klein asked in a serene but deep voice. And what's in it for me? So far, the only thing Chariot had said had exclusively benefited the Scarlet Monarch. There was no mention of what he would gain. Fool's identity preached equivalent exchange, and it was okay to show a little discomfort about this, but Klein made sure not to exaggerate as he was sure that the gains for fulfilling the exchange would be mentioned right now. Smiling beneath his mask of reassurance, Adrian continued, when the time comes for you to ascend to the throne of Sequence 0, you will not only have my lord's support but also his protection should the god of deception appear. Klein stopped counting the number of times he had been surprised in the last few minutes. Under the thick gray fog, his eyebrows rose slightly before they were immediately lowered. The throne of Sequence 0. What the fuck is that? Is there something beyond Sequence 1? Is Sequence 0 the level of the gods? But wouldn't that mean that the gods at some point were also beyonders? Klein was struck by the realization, and he was barely able to stop his body from shaking. His heart was pounding with such intensity that he felt his senses become affiliated with the speed of the blood rushing through his body, even though this was not his real body but only his spiritual one. The ancestor of the Antigonus family was someone who tried to ascend to God but failed. The title of this ancestor was the Half-Fool. Perhaps, the name of Sequence 0 of the Seer pathway is the Fool. It made sense that this would be the case, otherwise why else would they call the ancestor who almost ascended to God the? Klein felt everything spinning around, how his mind did a somersault and hit the concrete floor face first. As his heart stopped and he felt himself ascend. Shaking his head, Klein wanted to laugh in defeat. What kind of script is this? What the fuck is this space? What does it all mean? What? Tap 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 tap. His finger tapped the edge of the bronze table again in a calm rhythm. Nothing like how he was feeling himself. But that rhythm snapped the clown out of his trance, and he barely managed to avoid reacting in panic. He immediately went into semi-cogitation to get a better grip on himself. Why is it that every time you open your mouth, you have worse news than the last? Klein cursed internally in extremely annoyed Chinese as he looked at the calm Chariot. Every time the man appeared, he always brought with him a disaster. What was he? A walking calamity. Single quote. Single quote. Oddly enough, Klein felt that was the best way to describe Chariot. Walking calamity. It fits him like a glove. Without holding it back this time, the clown let out a light sigh that carried all his frustration. Tap tap tap. Staring at the black-robed man, Klein spoke, "Is there anything else to add?" With a nod, Adrian continued, "Please excuse the boldness, but my lord expects to receive an answer as soon as I return to my body. The situation is dire, and we cannot afford to waste time." Tap tap. His finger paused for a moment before continuing. Klein felt his clown skills being pushed to the absolute limit. They must be desperate if they are giving me so little time to make a decision. Klein tried to console himself. Sure, I also shouldn't rule out that this is a way to force me to make a decision quickly and not think so much about the dangers it might bring. Letting out a slight inward sigh, Klein stopped tapping the table and rested his cheek in the palm of his hand. Right now, Klein wished with all his might that he could crack Chariot's head open and get all the information he possessed out of him. I have no idea what organizations are after Chariot. But if the Scarlet Monarch was forced to ask for my help, it's safe to assume there are at least 3 of them. Considering his horrible personality, I wouldn't be surprised if they're all after him. His inside joke didn't soothe the tension he felt in his stomach but only made it worse. His inner expression soured and Klein wished with all his might that he could say no. But he knew that even though he was not going to be able to say no, he had to accept. Despite the great dangers that accepting would bring, the gains outweighed the danger. Not only will the Tarot Club gain the protection of a truly mysterious and great existence, but I will finally get a clue as to how to get home. God of Deception. Any being with the same title as Loki is always trouble. If the Scarlet Monarch felt he had to warn him about this existence through Adrian Kenway, then that meant he was quite possibly an enemy. Or at the very least, dangerous to him. With all this in mind and after long contemplation, Klein let out a soft sigh, and the tension in the air eased. Tell the Scarlet Monarch I accept the deal. Klein saw through the semi-thick mist that covered Chariot's face. A small smile appeared on that face. The man rose and bowed gracefully with one hand on his chest. My lord will be very glad to hear your answer, Mr. Fool. You are a kind being, I am eternally grateful for this and will never forget it. Giving a weak nod, Klein replied fully, it is nothing special. The clown's brow furrowed slightly behind the thick mist that covered his face. An uncomfortable sensation covered his entire body. This was not a warning of his spirituality or the clown's sense of danger. This discomfort came from what he knew of Chariot and how he acted. From the experience of seeing how the other members of the Tarot Club suffered under his hand. Klein right now felt like he had just made a deal with the devil. Before he could continue his discomfort, Chariot added in a somewhat mischievous tone. If your blessed ever needs a hand, you can always count on me. I'll be sure to give you a big discount. Single quote. Single quote. Klein said nothing. He just nodded with a flat expression. That would be all from my lord's commission. Now, I would like to continue with the use of my contribution points if that is all right with you, Mr. Fool. Adrian gave a small bow, and Klein bit the inside of his cheek. With all that had happened, he had forgotten what Chariot had said earlier. Controlling his movements, Klein nodded and swallowed his annoyance. To what do you wish, Mr. Chariot? Adrian gave a weak nod and made his request. The discomfort and slight fear of what the man might ask for subsided and was replaced by mild surprise. Just that, really. Having confirmed that that was all Chariot wanted, Klein saw nothing wrong with the request but even saw a huge gain if what the man said was true. It's a simple request. 11 a.m. Friday, August 17th. Sherwood Borough, House of Zeo and Furs. A bandaged Furs sat shakily on the soft couch in the living room, being careful not to sit down all at once so that the stitches in her back wouldn't open up. She had not yet been able to go to the hospital because they were bursting at the seams. The streets were empty, and people refused to go outside. Luckily, the quick treatment Zeo gave her managed to treat her most serious injuries, and with the night's sleep, she could move better, but she had to be extremely careful not to move too fast unless she wanted to risk rupturing the stitches. She also had to stay calm and rest in a quiet environment in order to recover well and avoid worsening her condition so that she could see a doctor later in the month. Batum, 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 Batum. All of the above didn't mean much when her heart was beating so fast and sweat covered her forehead in the otherwise cold room. The day before, the house door had been destroyed, so Zio managed to fix it as best she could. Speaking of her best friend, she was standing next to her. Her brow deeply furrowed in annoyance, and her foot tapping the floor with speed, a clear sign of the anger the sheriff was feeling at the moment. One of her hands rested on the triangular sword at her waist, and her emerald eyes regarded the man sitting across from them with suspicion. If you keep looking at me like that, miss, I'll think you want to slap me. The red-haired man commented with a sideways grin as his cheek rested in the palm of his bandaged hand. Furs couldn't help but wonder if that didn't hurt, but the man's expression always remained calm and free of any discomfort or pain. Quote. While I'm glad you're well, Kenway. That doesn't mean I want to see you right now. What is the reason for your visit? That hurts, miss. And I thought we had something special. I'm not in the mood for games. Tell me why you're here before I kick you out. Furs' expression quivered a little and she couldn't help but give her friend a sideways glance. Ha 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 ha. I didn't know you were a comedian, miss. That you'd force me out, you say. Uff, that's a good joke. Letting out a loud laugh as he slapped his knee in amusement, Adrian looked teasingly at the sheriff. Do you really think you're capable of doing that? Furs would never say it, but she agreed with the madman sitting across from them. While her friend was strong, she wouldn't stand a chance. It would be a massacre. Zio, knowing the two, clenched her free fist tightly and began to tremble in place for a few seconds before letting out a long sigh as she threw herself on the couch in defeat. Quote. What do you want, Mr. Kenway? Placing a hand on her friend's leg in silent support, Furs looked at the man in front of them who gave a satisfied nod at Zio's words. First of all, I wanted to verify that you guys are still alive. You may be a bit shitty, but you're still in one piece, which I'm glad about. Quote. Thanks for the concern, but if that was all you can go now. Zio replied, annoyed as she growled, which earned a chuckle from the redhead. Oh, please don't get ahead of yourself, miss. That was only one of the reasons I came. The next is to offer you something, if you're interested in listening to me, of course. Zio raised an eyebrow at that, and her green gaze collided with Furs' blue one, which was filled with doubt and confusion. The sheriff could easily see the uncertainty in her friend and decided to lower her hand and squeeze hers in reassurance. Furs gave her a weak smile on her bandaged face. After a few seconds and seeing that the writer was calmer, Zio returned her attention to Adrian, who had a strange smile on his face. Before she could say anything to wipe that smile off her face, Adrian shot teasingly. You guys are really cute, you know. Congratulations, by the way, you make a cute couple. A blush exploded on both women's faces, and Zio tried to pull her hand away from the writers after realizing she still hadn't let go. To her surprise, Furs struggled for a moment before letting go with a slight frown in frustration. Ah, why are you treating your wounded girlfriend like this? Can't you see you're hurting her little heart? Are you going to say your offer or what? Zio growled, fed up with the man's provocations. While she saw him as a friend, right now, she was in no mood to deal with his bullshit. Sorry. I went a little overboard. Raising his hands in surrender, Adrian laughed softly as he smiled in apology. Kenway, I'm serious. What do you want, Mr. Kenway? I'm honestly exhausted, and I just want to sleep now, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd finish your business and leave. Both Adrian and Zio turned to look at a frozen Furs who had her hands over her mouth. Her pale skin only grew as she watched an amused smile grow on the red-haired man's face. Oh, looks like the goldfish turned into a piranha. What kind of miracle is this? A huge blush covered her face, and Furs panicked. I didn't mean what? I mean, I just wanted to sleep already. I'd better shut up. Her head hung in defeat, and her brown hair covered her eyes. Single quote. Zio just stared for a long time at her friend, her expression unreadable. Each passing second made the writer grow smaller and smaller. After exactly 45 seconds, the sheriff returned her attention to the red-haired boy, who had been looking at the writer with mischievous eyes all this time. Feeling the sight upon him, Ruby collided with Emerald. A wordless message was conveyed, and the redhead nodded. Already satisfied with his games, Adrian finally explained the reason for his visit. I come to offer you a place on my team. A blonde eyebrow raised, and the writer poked her head slightly. Both looked at the red-haired man as if he were someone else. Ignoring their stares, Adrian continued. You don't seem to understand, so I'll keep it simple. Backland has just suffered a horrific attack by the Rose School of Thought that has left over 160,000 dead so far. A number that will only grow as the days go by and as more bodies are uncovered. Of course, with the bodies, they can recover. So it really was a terrorist attack. Furs muttered as she frowned deep in thought. What does that have to do with it, Mr. Kenway? Zio asked seriously. She didn't want to beat around the bush about this. The guy in her house was wanted by the 3 churches of the Loan Kingdom and had a £50,000 bounty on his head. Every second he spent here not only endangered her but Furs as well. And with her current state, using one of the stones to escape would surely kill her. You still don't get it? Adrian asked, slightly surprised, his eyes a little wide. Get to the point, Kenway. A secret organization attacked in broad daylight and completely humiliated the 3 churches. In the current state of Backland, who is still on the ground bleeding and has not been able to begin to recover. How do you think the churches will move on this? They would ensure that the unallied Beyonders don't worsen the situation by placing teams in strategic locations and shutting down any uncontrolled Beyonder parties. Zio's expression grew alarmed mid-explanation, finally understanding what the man was referring to. Bingo. Snapping his fingers at the sheriff, Adrian answered the unasked question. Backland will be locked down, and it will be impossible to enter. If you are an unallied Beyonder and you are caught doing something, you will most likely be imprisoned and used as a test subject for sealed artifacts. Of course, once the cells are full, they'll start killing straight away. They'll do this to send a message to those who haven't been caught yet. If you break the ceramic, we'll break you. Do you know what that implies? After a few seconds of silence, Zio nodded weakly and replied, that's until Backland recovers from their wounds. All unofficial Beyonder activity will cease. That means no more potion formulas, no more ingredients, no more opportunities to investigate what happened to her father. Until Backland recovers, it wouldn't be crazy to think that Beyonder activity here will be null and void, Adrian commented calmly as he looked at the frozen duo in front of him. And I'm sure neither of you can afford that, right? Zio bit the inside of her cheek and brought a hand to her forehead. No matter how she saw it, the redhead was right. While her not being able to afford that might be an exaggeration, the same couldn't be said for Furs. The writer was pale and had put her hands to her head. How am I going to survive now? With no potion formulas or mystical ingredients, Furs was trapped in Sequence 8. The only reason I survived that sudden blood moon for as long as I did was because it was Sequence 8, but it won't stay that way. If I ever use the stone before I can advance, then the ravings will get worse, and I won't make it through the next blood moon. When she first suffered the ravings of the blood moon, they had not been as horrible as the ravings she suffered after using one of the stones. Every time she used one, the ravings got permanently worse. The writer looked at her friend, who looked worried. She was probably thinking the same thing as she was. The decision had already been made for them. Furs' condition gave them no choice. Gritting her teeth and grinding them, Zio glared as hard as she could at the red-haired man. The aura of majesty around her heightened and gave her a slight gleam in her green eyes. What do we gain if we join? They may have no choice but to accept, but at least she wanted to make sure it wasn't a waste. If what we gain doesn't make up for having to give up everything, then as soon as we leave Backland and end up in a city, we'll look for somewhere else to live. Smiling calmly, Adrian nodded. He rested his cheek on his bandaged palm and extended 3 fingers towards them. First, Matim and I will protect you. In return, I expect you to do the same. Second, you won't have to worry about potions or ingredients. Between all of us we will help each other to find them, and no matter the price we will be able to afford it. We have money, after all. With each thing he said, a finger went down until there was only one left. Interestingly, this one pointed at Zio. Third, and this one is more specific to you. Raising an eyebrow in question, the sheriff waited for the man to continue. Smiling simply, Adrian spoke. Ads by PubFuture. You will have the chance to avenge your father. An hour later, Backland Bridge, Braveheart's bar. Watching as the old man closed the door to the billiard room, the man quickly moved down the hallway until his footsteps disappeared into the distance. The drink in his hand moved calmly, and his expression remained calm as he looked at the pale man in front of him. It's been a while, hasn't it? How have you been, Mr. Marich? With his ever-present waistcoat, eyes glinting with malice, Marich looked seriously at the man in front of him. Quote. What are you doing here, Mr. Kenway? His zombies were nowhere to be seen, so they were alone. Looking around with a bored look on his face, Adrian took a swig of his lion's tail. Feeling the sweet and spicy touch, combined with the sweetness of the grenadine, the acidity of the lemon, and the complex taste of the brandy, the redhead let out a satisfied sigh as he downed the drink on the table. Well, that would be easy to explain, but I'd rather we were all visible for that. That's the least of having manners, don't you think? Marich's expression froze for a moment before he grunted. The man slowly began to rise to his feet at the red-haired man's bored look. Marich, sit down, a sweet voice said from beside him. Marich tensed for a moment before letting out a grunt and doing as he was asked. Beside the zombie, in the once empty spot now stood a beautiful woman. Her skin was pale, and she had blonde hair, blue eyes, and delicate features. She wore a beautiful, regal Gothic dress and a soft hat. Smiling at the newcomer, Adrian gave a slight nod. It is an honor to finally meet you, Madame Sharon. If she was surprised that he knew her name, she didn't show it, unlike Marich, who looked at the redhead in surprise. Ignoring her companion's reaction, she asked in a soft voice, "What is it you wanted to talk about, Mr. Kenway?" "I won't beat around the bush. I want you to join my team." Marich snorted in derision at his words. "And why do you think we would do that?" "Because you guys are desperate," Adrian replied without looking at the zombie. His eyes were always on Sharon, who looked at him with a serene expression. Marich grunted at the response and quickly tried to defend himself. "I don't know what gave you that idea, but you are part of the temperance faction of the Rose School. I doubt I need to say more than that." Bored scarlet eyes looked at the frozen zombie who had his mouth half open. "How did you?" Marich muttered in a daze. "Marich, there's no use pretending. Mr. Adrian seems to be aware of the situation." Sharon spoke calmly, her expression never changing, making Adrian think she was a doll. Single quote. Single quote. The zombie said nothing more, just squinted at the man, his fists on the table clenched. "Since we're calmer now, how about we start this chat with something strong?" Adrian asked with a smile as he took another sip of his drink. "This is no time for drinking. If you were planning on recruiting us, Steve is dead." Single quote. Single quote. Marich's jaw hung, and Sharon's delicate eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "Same with Jason and Tyre. All three are dead. I don't know if you knew him, but so is Joseph." "I killed them all," Adrian commented nonchalantly as he placed a container on the table and slid it towards the duo. "Due to the situation, I was only able to retrieve Joseph's characteristics, which are in that container," Adrian said. "Check it out if you like." Blue eyes moved to the container. A delicate hand opened it, breaking through the wall of spirituality. Inside, the jet stone seemed to absorb the light and exude an air of filth and evil. Those cold eyes looked deep into the stone in the container. After a few seconds, Sharon closed it and slid it over to Adrian. Quote. "They are Joseph's," the wraith replied, her eyes glowing slightly. Marich looked at the man in front of them in disbelief. "How? Trade secrets?" Smiling at the duo in front of him, Adrian winked mischievously. "But if you join in, I might tell you what happened," the red-haired man chirped as he took another sip of his drink. Both members of the temperance faction looked deeply at the man sitting across from them. After a few long minutes of staring at the man, they both looked at each other. Marich returned his attention to the man with a serious face, but the sneer from before was gone. "Tell us about this team." Rose Street, Harvest Church. 3 hours later. "I refused. I will not take a child with me." Adrian growled in annoyance as he looked at the father in front of him. The two were now alone in the giant man's room. A loud argument had started a while ago, and neither side was backing down. "You have to, Mr. Kenway. Little Jerry's place is not with this church but with you. The same with Miss Opera and Miss Serena," Utravsky said calmly, earning a fiery glare from the redhead. "Who the fuck do you think you are to tell me who I can and can't take? What will you do if I don't take her with me? Will you throw her out on the street and let her fend for herself after losing her father? Is the Church of Mother Earth so heartless?" The father's expression quivered for a second before he let out a sad sigh. These are orders from the higher ranks. I can't do anything about it. Harvest Church will be closed and will be relocated to East Borough to help with the wounded. The church will remain, but I will not. I will be moved elsewhere, and I can't take the little ones where I am going. A farmer doesn't pull up the seeds that are not yet flowering when he passes but leaves them in the care of someone else to nurture and nourish them. Aren't you listening to yourself, old man? You are leaving them to me. Me. I have a bounty on my head, and after today, everyone will be my enemy. I can take Opera, but not Serena, let alone Jerry. That life is not something a girl should have to go through. The father let out a heavy sigh. He turned and walked to the window of his room, where he looked longingly at the image of the Earth Mother symbol on it. Little Jerry's stay was always temporary. The same with Miss Opera. I was just looking after them for you, but not anymore. The man spoke calmly and looked over his shoulder at the red-haired man who was throwing daggers at him with his eyes. You have to take responsibility for saving their lives, Mr. Kenway. And have them die because I took them where they weren't supposed to be in the first place. Fuck off, old man. Utravsky didn't seem bothered by the insult. He just continued to stare at the Earth Mother symbol, and after a few moments, he spoke. Talk to them, Mr. Kenway. I won't change my decision, not that I would be able to even if I wanted to. Perhaps you will learn something about them that will surprise you. Adrian looked coolly at the back of the giant who, like a mountain, stood firm against his assault. Without another word, the red-haired man turned and left the room. Are you sure you want to follow me? Adrian, the only reason I took the potion was so I could walk beside you. You are my friend and my savior. Nothing would make me happier than to accompany you. The chance of you dying will be high. Why don't you work in one of the other churches? You're good with children. I'm sure there's a place for you in one of the schools. Adrian, my life ended the moment my parents sold me to Deadshot. I was just walking around aimlessly, I was breathing and eating, but I wasn't alive, that was until you saved me. You gave me a new chance and purpose. I decide what I'm going to do with that chance and I want to use it to go with you. Please, Adrian, don't take this away from me. I don't think I'll be able to take it. Adrian looked at Opera's reddened eyes, and after a few long seconds of silence, he nodded. Fine. If you wish. Why do you want to follow me? I don't know you, let alone trust you. I'm grateful that you saved me, but that doesn't score you any points. Mr. Kenway, you are my hero. There would be no greater honor than to follow you. Please give me the chance. I'll be raw with you. Look in a mirror, your body is tired, and you haven't had time to eat. You are weaker than a normal person, and you have no education. If I take you with me, you will be a burden. Single quote. It is better for you to stay here. Don't throw away your new chance because you feel a debt to me. You still have a life in front of you. I have nothing. Single quote. Everything was taken away from me. My family, my friends, my home, my job. I lost everything. Cough. Cough. Adrian looked calmly at the woman as she began to cough loudly. He made no move to help her as she fell to the floor but just watched impassively. As soon as the woman caught her breath, she continued to cry helplessly. The only job that was willing to take a broken woman like me was destroyed by the earthquake as well as the kind man who took me in. Those monsters took everything from me. What does it matter if I die because I followed you? At least, I will do it with a purpose. If I stay here, I'll just starve to death or die at the hands of bastards. Falling to her knees, thick tears fell from her eyes. Serena looked pleadingly at the redhead, who looked at her with a calm gaze. Please, please, please. For once in my life. I want to choose how I die. Single quote. Adrian looked deeply into the eyes of the woman who gripped his trousers tightly. His eyes were empty of any emotion. There will be no turning back, you know. I don't care. If I die, it will have been because of a decision I made. Not because someone else made it for me. Sigh. Okay. Mr. Kenway, I can take care of myself. You're a child. This world is not for you. And the world I lived in was. That was the kind of world a child should live in. No, it isn't. I won't defend it, not that hell you lived in. But the world you want to enter, that's a much worse hell. I can take it. You can't. If I have you by my side, I can. I won't always be there to protect you. In this world, either you take care of yourself or you die. No one will hold your hand. Jerry paused in her defense. Her gray eyes looked into Adrian's cold face, which let no emotion pass. When my father died, I thought I lost everything. Single quote. Single quote. All desire to live was taken away from me, just like my father. When I was kidnapped, I thought I was already dead, either they would kill me or the wretch they sold me to. Single quote. Single quote. But you saved me, comforted me, and offered me your shoulder to cry on. You never pushed me away but embraced me and didn't let me go. Single quote. Single quote. Quote. After that, you gave me a new home, with warm food and soft, clean beds. With people who care about me and treat me with great love. Now I will lose that too. Single quote. Single quote. Mr. Kenway, I know I'm just a little girl, and I can't do much, but, would you allow me to ask you one last thing? Don't abandon me in an orphanage. Don't take my home away from me. Sigh. A heavy sigh left his lips, and the red-haired boy shook his head softly before patting the head of the girl who was crying her eyes out. You will do whatever I say and whenever I say it. No buts, and you'll always be close to us, okay? Jerry's eyes widened, and a huge toothy grin blossomed on this one. Yes. You're going to regret this, you know that, don't you? Flora commented calmly. I know. Adrian answered nonchalantly as he prepared the last container and closed it with his spirituality. With nothing more to say, the shadows enveloped the red-haired man, and he disappeared from the scene. Power of knowledge. Power of reason. God of wisdom. I pray for the power of knowledge. I pray for the power of rationality. I pray for you to hear my voice. Adrian, what are you doing here? Smiling at the alarmed man, Adrian said, Sorry for the inconvenience, teacher, but I have a favor to ask. Is the offer to go to Lindbergh still open? Isengard looked at his former student in astonishment. He could hardly recognize him, and he felt both pride and pity for him. So, with a heavy heart, he slowly shook his head. Quote. I don't know, Adrian. After what you did and everything else, I don't know if the church is willing to shelter you now. Adrian didn't look worried in the slightest. Instead, his smile grew a little sharper. I wouldn't be so sure about that, teacher, could you at least try? Who knows, you might be in for a surprise. Lowering the skull bell, the red-haired man smiled at his messenger, who returned the smile but weakly. I didn't expect you to respond, but it's a welcome surprise. How are you feeling? I've been in worse, so I can still get around. Nothing a nap won't fix. Well, Lord Adrian, what message shall I send this time? Smiling mischievously, Adrian moved over, revealing the huge bags full of chocolate behind him. The next day, Saturday, August 18, 1349, not only had the news of what had happened in Backland already reached the rest of the world, but every newspaper carried a new story, and a news item appeared on the billboards of various Beyonders parties around the world. Upon learning about them, Klein wanted to kill a certain redhead. On the afternoon of Sunday the 19th of August, a report of the events of last Wednesday was sent to the mandated punishers of the Church of the Lord of Storms and to the machinery hivemind of the Church of the God of Steam on behalf of the Church of the Evernight Gods. This is a report on the accumulated data from last Thursday's events, information provided by the wild Beyander Adrian Kenway, and further research by the aforementioned teams. All of this will be passed on to the aforementioned churches to gather the information available and make future investigations easier. Background. At the beginning of June, a character made an appearance in a bar on Red Street in East Borough accompanied by someone else who, to date, remains unknown. He called himself James Holmes, and his first act was to kidnap the Black Skull's second-in-command. James Holmes was a false name, the true identity under the mask was that of Adrian Kenway, one of the survivors of the Witches' Feast event. For more information on the Witches' Feast and the events that transcribed, a separate file will be sent containing all the information that was gathered before his identity as James Holmes was revealed. About 2 weeks later, a huge explosion rocked Mulloch Viscera, with its point of origin being an abandoned fishing lodge. The team in charge of investigating the event was the machinery hivemind led by Ekenzer Bernard. The rotting remains of at least 50 bodies were discovered in the wreckage of the establishment. The next day, a message was delivered to all 3 churches. The forms of delivery were different, some violent, such as the destruction of a window in the Church of the Lord of Storm, and others more gentle, delivered directly to the workers who worked during the night in the Church of the Evernight Gods. The information revealed by Adrian Kenway is documented in File 1389-56B, which will also be attached to the above-mentioned file. The three churches united and destroyed all Black Skull bases and almost all members of the gang. The only one who managed to escape was the leader of the gang, Joseph. This act would not be the only time he destroyed a gang, either directly or indirectly. Over the next 2 months since his first appearance, Adrian Kenway hunted down and destroyed the most dangerous gangs in East Borough. A pattern was noticed that all the gangs he destroyed were known for kidnapping people and selling them into slavery. He destroyed each one by using Beyander's powers, which he used in front of large numbers of people and quickly gained popularity. It didn't take long for him to earn the name of a figure that the people of East Borough would look up to on a pedestal. His name even resounded on the high steps of Empress Borough, because of the danger he presented in keeping the world of the Beyonders in the dark. An operation was started to arrest him. With each gang he destroyed, the operation grew larger and became more important. It reached the point where multiple church teams were stationed in East Borough to catch him. No matter what efforts were made, the man could not be found. Then, he sent another message. The account books of the recently destroyed dead rose. From January of this year until the last days of July, there was a spike in the number of disappearances in East Borough. An alarming number of those people ended up in the hands of a mystery shopper, which we now know was the Rose School of Thought. It was impossible to investigate the gangs on the list. All the gangs had already been destroyed, all by the same man. By Adrian Kenway. Because of all this, the situation in East Borough was elevated to maximum importance. Elite teams from the churches were moved to strategic areas where the man had last been seen and to areas where gangs were circulating. Despite all these new efforts, there was only one occasion when the man was almost caught. The only time he was cornered was after his battle with Pirate Admiral Kilongos. Despite being surrounded by the Machinery Hivemind and Nighthawk's teams, both led by Ekanzer Bernard and Watson Ulib, Adrian Kenway managed to escape. Shortly afterward, the bounty on Kilongos was claimed using only his head. It is certain that after escaping the scene, Adrian Kenway tracked down Kilongos and killed him. The bounty was claimed on Sonia Island in the Sonia Sea. A messenger is almost certain to have been used. For the next few weeks, Adrian Kenway's activity was nil. Any supposed trial was either false or someone wanted to get their hands on the recent bounty on his head. Then, on the morning of Tuesday, August 14, 1349, on Celeste Street, a charm was used by John Lennon, who we later identified as the leader of the fallen Dead Rose. The charm summoned a meat door, using him as material and killing him. The door not only took out many of the people on the street but also managed to trap Adrian Kenway. The method John Lennon used to track him down is completely unknown. Any tracking method or divination used to obtain information about the target proved to be ineffective or failed completely. Subsequent research revealed that it was a high-level apprentice pathway charm made from unknown materials. The divination on the charm has proven to be dangerous and has been postponed for the future. Just 2 days later, at noon on Thursday the 16th of August, a huge explosion struck deep in East Borough. This was followed by a powerful earthquake estimated to have measured 8.6 on the GSRCHER scale. Poor building, poor maintenance, and age only added to the death toll. Following the earthquake, night fell all over Backland. The angels who were ready to enter in case Rose School acted with the suspected ritual were unable to do so. All those who had a contract with a spirit were also unable to summon them. By the words of the high command of the churches, the city had been separated from the rest of the world. Following that, a huge tree rose up in the depths of East Borough. According to eyewitnesses, its texture was flesh-like, and it beat as if it were a huge heart. With the tree's appearance and the earthquake still pounding the earth, a huge number of people in East Borough turned into ghoul-like monsters. The teams that witnessed the transformation commented that most of those transformed were homeless and criminals, with a few workers. These people turned into monsters, further increasing the number of casualties after the explosion and earthquake as they attacked every living thing that moved with priority given to humans. Father Utravsky of Harvest Church on Rose Street in Sherwood Borough sent information about the monsters. 20 years ago, In Fainapotter, there was an event with similar creatures. People became these monsters after consuming pink dust, which had various hallucinogenic and pallant effects. This drug works as a seed that, after performing a specific ritual, will take control of the host and mutate it into a beast with an insatiable thirst for blood. The qualities of the pink powder of 20 years ago and the pink powder of today are the same, and the perpetrators of the event are the same. This massive attack had only one perpetrator. The Rose School of Thought, an evil organization that believes in the primordial moon. For half an hour, the forces of the churches and the forces of the Rose School clashed in East Borough, with heavy losses on both sides. The Rose School elite forces clashed with the church's elite forces, which included the archbishops of the three churches. Everything was in a stalemate, neither force could overcome the other. While all this was going on, a huge storm was forming over all of Backland. According to Ace Snake, that storm had the power to destroy the entire city if it released all the energy it was building up. Just as the storm was about to reach the necessary energy, another weaker earthquake hit the battlefield. The tree grew again, reaching heights that pierced the storm clouds. After a few seconds of that, a platform with a huge, mutated infant emerged from the earth. As soon as the infant emerged, an enormous amount of lightning struck, but a barrier blocked it. A few seconds after the lightning struck, a Dryan Kenway also emerged from the earth, accompanied by a pillar of golden fire. As soon as he showed himself, the baby showed terror and summoned a thick cocoon of huge ivy, sealing himself inside. Seeing this, a Dryan Kenway flew as high as he could without leaving the barrier, shouted orders to the churches, and then provoked the gods. According to witnesses, at almost the same instant, multiple lightning bolts began to fall in his direction, trying to strike him, but they were stopped by the crimson barrier. This would be the only witnessed moment where a person receives divine punishment and survives. Shortly thereafter, a Dryan Kenway, through his powers over fire, created an albino dragon that the nearby Nighthawks heard he named Ignir. Its measurements easily reached and slightly exceeded 10 meters in height. The construct was so lifelike that the debate continues as to whether he actually summoned a living dragon or was just a construct of his powers. And that was not all, for no sooner had the dragon formed. An armor of golden fire covered the man, which, although it didn't seem to have many details, looked very much like ancient armor before the invention of firearms. As soon as the dragon took shape and let out a huge roar, they both rushed towards the cocoon. After dodging the ivies that rushed at them, the dragon struck the cocoon, taking advantage of the window created by a Dryan Kenway, who used a cry similar to a baby's cry that paralyzed the ivies. After that, the dragon hit the cocoon with a force that fell several streets up and began to make its way to the baby. The effect of the scream wore off, and the ivies attacked again, forcing a Dryan Kenway to jump off the dragon Ignir's back to dodge as it continued to destroy the cocoon despite being pierced. The ivy eventually killed the construct, but Ignir had managed to create a window into the baby. A Dryan Kenway took advantage of this and launched an attack best described as a sphere compressed to its maximum limit and releasing a horrible high-pitched screeching sound. The attack sounded like thunder and went through the window. The effects of the attack could not be seen because as soon as the sphere made contact with the interior, the tree and the storm covering Backland disappeared in an instant. It is quite possible that this was divine intervention. Whatever the baby was, it had been preventing the gods from acting before, and when it was destroyed, they were able to deal with the problem. With the tree gone, the monsters dropped dead soon after. It seems that the tree acted as a sort of controller, and without it, the severely mutated bodies of the people could finally rest. Shortly after the monster fell, they turned to ash. The why is still unknown. Seeing that they had been defeated, the forces of the Rose School of Thought tried to escape. The demigods used charms similar to the one used to trap a Dryan Kenway and managed to escape. Most of the forces on the ground from the Rose School managed to be captured or neutralized. Ace Snake reported that as soon as his enemy escaped with the help of the charm, he went in pursuit of a Dryan Kenway, but the man was nowhere to be found. As with the tree, he had vanished into thin air. Barely a day passed when, on Friday evening, a message arrived at the doors of the three churches in the cathedrals. No one witnessed when it appeared. It was a small metallic package. After using several divinations to find out who sent the package, all the results failed or gave the same result: infinite darkness. It was a package from a Dryan Kenway. Those results were his signature. After securing an area and sealing it using artifact 1 to 56, the small metal container was opened. Contrary to expectations, there were only 3 things inside: an envelope signed with the initials F, Y, and 2 tarot cards. It is unknown what the initials F, Y stand for, but they don't seem to be of any importance other than to provoke. Upon opening the envelope, the letter had only a few words written in Loanese and Fasak. The language in which the information was shared was maintained for security reasons. For the same reasons, it is strictly forbidden to write the following in any language with power, as the content of the letter was an honorific name of a great existence. An honorific name of 3 lines that, according to the mysticism knowledge, points towards a god. The letter read as follows: The Scarlet Monarch who burns depravity. Adds by PubFuture. The calamity forgotten by time. The stranger who comes from the unknown. 7 In case you are a drunk fool and don't understand something so easy. The packet contained the tarot cards numbers 0 and 7, the Fool and the Chariot. Both cards were placed next to each other, at the same level and at the same distance, resting on a red handkerchief. The way the cards were placed means that they are both equal, at the same level, and of equal importance. Because of the note left at the bottom of the card and the way the cards were placed, it is theorized that the mysterious entity, the Fool, has the same level as the entity called the Scarlet Monarch. The implication of a 3-line honorific name is clear in the world of mysticism. Only God can use a 3-line name. If the honorific name is anything to go by, it is very likely that the Scarlet Monarch is a god. And if the Fool is on the same level as him, and his equal, so is he. Another possibility could be that this is a codename in the organization behind him. The 7 in the letter could mean that Adrian Kenway is the Chariot, but this would mean that he wasn't acting alone, and there was another one being the Fool. The more probable possibility is that it is both cases. The cards represent the gods behind this new organization and can also represent the agents involved in the event. With Adrian Kenway being the Chariot, and this mysterious person being the Fool. More investigation is going on. Churches were not the only ones to receive this information. Several newspapers and places of interest in Backland also received it. It is noteworthy that it did not stay only in the Loan Kingdom, but there are reports of newspapers in Intis, Fasak, Fanepotter, and Lemberg that also received the information and were not slow to publish it. Along with several Beyonders gatherings, this information appeared suddenly on their boards. Considering this movement, it is certain that the other Orthodox churches also received a package. Combining all the information presented, all the investigations carried out during the persecution, and what happened last Thursday, there are 2 possibilities. First, Adrian Kenway is not a Beyander of mid-sequence as initially believed but is, at the very least, a demigod of sequence 4. We do not rule out that he is a higher sequence, but there is not enough evidence to support this possibility. The abilities he displayed with his powers, the feats he accomplished with them, and the power of his attacks, the anti-divination ability that even grade 1 artifacts are unable to find. It is quite possible that all this time, Adrian Kenway was always a demigod but was hiding his strength. The reason for this is explained with the second possibility. It is theorized that Adrian Kenway was preparing the churches for what was coming all this time. From the time he set foot in the Backland ports until he killed Kilongos. By forcing the churches to chase him, to station themselves in specific areas and move them by suddenly appearing in other places, bringing in larger forces to chase him when the previous numbers proved insufficient. If we remove the teams that were there to catch Adrian Kenway, the teams that were called in later, the elite forces that were called in. According to calculations, if those forces had not been there to contain the monsters and the Rose School force, the human losses would have easily exceeded 2 million, and we would have lost East Borough. Not only that, but the damage would not only have been in East Borough but would have spread to the rest of Backland. It is likely that as early June, when he first appeared, Adrian Kenway manipulated the churches to prepare to control and contain what happened that day. This prompted us to mobilize some of our spies located in the Fasak Empire to search for information about him. The following information is what the spies have found so far. Adrian Kenway was born on September 21, 1327. He is an orphan who was raised in an orphanage of the Church of the God of Combat and lived his entire life there. He only recently left at the end of May for Balam, where he stayed for a few days, and then mysteriously appeared in Bansi Harbor, where he then went to Backland at the beginning of June. A few days into his trip from Balam, he disappeared and reappeared in Bansi Harbor, where he then took a Backland ship. Further investigations are ongoing. He completed his basic schooling at the same orphanage and received basic combat classes. There is no record of him receiving advanced education, and his academic grades were slightly above average, while his combat grades were excellent. His parents were named Gabriel Kenway and Rosa Kenway. Their bodies are buried in the Fallen Warriors Cemetery. They are being investigated at the moment, but all indications are that they suffered natural deaths. So far, they have failed to find a birth certificate, but this could easily be due to the fact that the area where he was born and raised is not very wealthy. It is only a matter of time before it is obtained, but it is not a priority. His date of birth was discovered because it was in his data at the orphanage. Research has not been able to determine where he might have had contact with the Beyonder world, but it is very likely that it was during his short time in Balam. All this information raises many questions. 1. Who is Adrian Kenway, and how does he know so much? It is assumed that he never interacted with the occult world, but this cannot be true. All the evidence shows otherwise and that he was exposed all his life. 2. Is any of the information obtained about him true? It is very likely that this is all false information. The investigations are slow because of the danger our spies face when trying to investigate in the FASAC territory. 3. What did the Rose School of Thought seek to achieve with this attack? The destruction of a key city for the kingdom could be seen as a risky but understandable move, but everything shows that there was more to it. The biggest proof is that infant. It is far more probable that it was some kind of ritual to the primordial moon, but we lack information. 4. Why is the Rose School of Thought so interested in Adrian Kenway? He was a virtual part of the ritual, which shows that the school knows a lot more about him than it lets on. 5. How did Adrian Kenway survive the ritual? According to the words of the demigod Ace Snake-Faced, he should have died. 6. What happened at the site of the ritual? 7. How did he manage to escape before the eyes of so many witnesses? 8. What is the organization behind Adrian Kenway? 9. What is the organization after? 10. How big is the organization, its resources, and its numbers? 11. What is the mysterious entity that calls itself the Scarlet Monarch looking for? 12. Is it a benign or evil entity? 13. Is Adrian Kenway blessed by this mysterious entity? If he is a sample of what the Scarlet Monarch seeks, then it is likely that he is a benign entity. Everything he did was to help improve the lives of the people in East Borough and even reduce the tragedy that struck the area, but this could also be a ploy. 14. What does the Tarot Fool and Chariot card mean? The way they were delivered implies that the Fool and Chariot work together. 15. Is the Fool another mysterious entity that helped to reduce and stop the tragedy? 16. What are the objectives of this other entity? 17. Are they both part of the same organization? Conclusion and recommendations. The hunt for the demigods seen and involved in the above events will become a priority. The level of danger posed by the Rose School of Thought will also increase. Underestimating this organization caused a great tragedy that cannot be allowed to happen again. The second highest priority will be to find out as much information as possible about Adrian Kenway, the Scarlet Monarch, and the Fool and the organization they are part of. If possible, take Adrian Kenway alive. His strangeness and the mystery surrounding him may be a warning of the danger he carries. Killing him may bring unknown consequences. We must not underestimate him. The following is an order that will be given to all teams in all churches. As soon as you spot the target, try to stay hidden and contact one of the 3 churches as quickly as possible. Do not go alone. Unless one has a team with a minimum of 2 Sequence 4 Beyonders and several Grade 1 artifacts and with several reinforcements ready to assist, one is ordered to flee in sight. Raising his hand, Anthony Stevenson let out a heavy sigh as he lowered the black fountain pen to the side of the sheet. A shadowy shadow rested on the shoulders of the Archbishop of Terror, the air in the room heavy and stifling. Checking the information and that everything was in order, Anthony passed this on and sent it through his messenger to the other churches. In this case, because of the great urgency, no one could afford the elegance of using telegrams unless, of course, they wanted to waste more time. Letting out another heavy sigh, Anthony rose from his red-pillowed seat and stared into nothingness for a moment. The darkness in the room grew for an instant, and the glow of the lamps disappeared into it. As quickly as it happened, the Archbishop disappeared from his place at his dark wooden table, reappearing in front of the place where the most dangerous artifact was kept. Anthony simply stared at the empty spot where 0 to 17 once stood with his lips pressed together. She had activated out of nowhere as soon as the sky had turned blue and disappeared from the place. Anthony let out another long, heavy sigh, something he had been doing constantly since Thursday. Hoping and praying that one of these days, 0 to 17 would be back in place. A grade 0 artifact had gone missing for the second time this century. Unlike the first time, this time, the artifact had no one to control it. Covering his chest 4 times, he said a silent prayer and left the room where she was kept. The higher ranks already knew that 0 to 17 was missing, but nothing had been done yet. This wasn't the first time Ella had done that. According to information from past uses, it was very possible that she was in a suspended state somewhere in Backland, and they had to find her. What a load of crap. Anthony let out a shaky sigh, barely able to contain his annoyance. The higher ranks were hiding something, he knew it. This wasn't the first time it had happened. When 008 was stolen, he felt the same way. There was something else at stake. A grade 0 artifact doesn't just disappear. Whatever was going on, hidden hands were pulling the strings. Lemberg, somewhere in the suburbs. Inside a simple room dimly lit by a lamp on the table. A blonde-haired man, blind in one eye, held the day's newspaper in his hands, the texture still warm and fresh off the press. In the back of his mind, a sinister laugh echoed, "Ah! What a reckless lunatic. Only a true madman would paint a target on his back in such a manner." The evil spirit within him exclaimed with dark glee. Ince froze for an instant, surprise written all over his face. The traitor of the church did not take long to recover, and his brow furrowed in annoyance. Ads by PubFuture. Ever since Panatia's curse led him to those strange ruins and he was forced to trap this spirit, the latter had barely spoken to him, and when it did, it was only to provoke him. This was the first time since he had caught him that the spirit had been so interested in anything. "So, what's the matter with you now? I didn't think there were such interesting things going on these days. I was already afraid it would be too easy. Ha 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 ha." Completely ignoring the writer's question and earning a grunt from him, the spirit continued, "Aren't you afraid of what will happen for doing that? Are you that arrogant? Or are you just stupid? Whatever it is, it's certainly interesting." There was an enormous youth in the sinister voice. The evil spirit understood what this meant. This was a battle cry. Here I am. Come for me. To the 4 winds. An announcement to all the great existences of the world that he will go for the throne of the divine. He knew it from his death until now. The throne was still vacant, and no one had sat down since the fall of that pesky brat. The Scarlet Monarch had shouted to all the great existences that they would take that throne. The throne of Sequence 0. The evil spirit let out another sinister cackle. 2 other voices echoed, but these were ignored. The sheer amusement he felt was too great to take into account the 2 annoying flies. Scarlet Monarch, Foo-foo. I accept your challenge. Looking at the picture in the newspaper, the evil spirit let out a soft chuckle at seeing the man in the front. The chuckle rapidly ascended to a pleased laugh, then to a mad cackle. Fingers yellowed from smoking clenched the newspaper so tightly in her hands that her knuckles turned white. With a small hat in her brown hair and her blue eyes full of fear, the woman let out a pathetic wail as she covered her face with the newspaper and let out a barely suppressed scream. Looking at her best friend, a somewhat short woman gulped and put a hand to her forehead. Normally, she would have berated her for acting so pathetically, but this time, she understood. "We teamed up with a guy who not only has a fortune on his head but is part of an organization that believes not only in one but 2 mysterious entities." Letting out a growl, annoyed emerald eyes turned to look at the figure sitting at the other end, who had a complacent smile on his pale face and red eyes that glowed mischievously. "I'm already regretting agreeing to follow you, Mr. Kenway." "Oh come on, miss, there's no gain without risk. Besides, it's not like I tricked you. I told you the risks, remember? You never mentioned that the whole world would be looking for you. Much less that you were following 2 mysterious entities." Zio slammed the table angrily and pointed an accusatory finger at the man, who only let out a chuckle. "I may have skipped a few facts. But don't worry, everything is going according to plan. Adrian commented as he took a sip from his cup and smiled happily as he savored the coffee. Oh, how I missed this. Zio looked at the man incredulously. Part of your plan is to have everyone after your head. Winking mischievously, Adrian nodded, yep. Whatever words were about to come out of her mouth died at such a simple answer. She dropped like a sack of potatoes in her chair and brought her hands to her face. I'm on a team with a madman. Hee hee. Come on, miss, don't be like that, I promise it'll be fun. Letting out a chuckle, Adrian stood up and walked with his cup in hand over to Zio, who just continued to stare at the floor. SSSSSSLLLLLURRRRRRPPPPP. Taking a long and exaggeratedly loud sip, the redhead laughed in amusement as the short woman's shoulders began to shake. Besides, it's not like you won't have the strength to defend yourself. The world is our enemy, remember. We have to be stronger if we want to survive, Adrian said, amused, as he placed a folded piece of paper next to Zio's coffee cup. Besides, it's not like your situation is any different. Miss Ryder here is not only a ticking time bomb but two organizations that are hunting everyone in her pathway. Not to mention you're both wild beyonders, so naturally, the churches were after you. Rolling his shoulders, Adrian continued, you could even say they are better off now. In group, there's a better chance of survival after all. Adrian turned and returned to his place. But not before patting Furs on the head, who began to tremble. Yeah, kitty, you don't have to be afraid. You're under my protection now, remember? Foo. Laughing darkly at the end, Adrian gave a final pat to the head of a trembling Furs and returned to his seat. Was it necessary to do that? Couldn't you just give it to them? Serena asked with a raised eyebrow in curiosity as she looked at one of the two duos sitting further away from them. Adrian just rolled his shoulders in an, I don't know, and continued drinking his cup. It's the way he shows he cares about you. Opera answered for the captain as she shoved a cookie into her mouth. He was even a little gentle with them. You should have seen what he did when Nathan and I first tried to join. He almost scared us to death. Sasha added her piece to the pie while letting out a loud laugh. You'll get used to it, Charlotte added as he glanced discreetly towards the far table. Serena just looked at the group in front of her as if they had grown multiple heads. You're a bully, Jerry said simply as she ate a biscuit, sitting right next to the redhead who patted her head with a smile. I love you too, Shaking his head, Adrian turned to where Charlotte was looking and smiled, so. You guys don't have anything to add to the complaint box. Lowering the newspaper in his hand, Marich shook his head as he tossed it onto the table. Our situation hasn't changed. We were always persecuted by the churches and the Rose School of Thought. Joining you gives us a chance to survive. Sharon, who was calmly sipping her cup of tea, just gave a nod to her companion's words with her eyes closed. Her gothic dress, as always, was ever present. Smiling sideways at the zombie's words, Adrian leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, feeling the potion inside him melt completely. Opening his scarlet eyes that now glowed brighter, Adrian let out a deep chuckle. Ah, pre-acting is undoubtedly ridiculously broken. One underestimates the enormous advantage you have by just knowing the names of the following sequence. Opening and closing his fist and feeling the new power within him, Adrian only let out another chuckle. He had long since discovered the conspirators' acting rules. Rules he had always abided by and never abandoned. Information is everything. The more information you have, the better. Information is a conspirator's sword and shield, depending on how he uses it. A conspirator never throws himself into a situation where he knows nothing, he must always take his time to evaluate everything and act accordingly. A conspirator must always gather information from his enemies and use it against them. Even in the midst of combat, the smallest detail can change everything. Adaptability is also a part of being one. A conspirator is strong not because of his strength but because of his mind. A conspirator who acts without a plan is not a conspirator. Letting out a sigh, he took a biscuit and popped it into his mouth. I wonder how long it will take me to digest Reaper's potion. With how I've been acting, I wouldn't be surprised if it melts in my mouth. After a few minutes, Furs pulled her face away from the paper. A slight blush on her cheeks. A memory hit her just as she was about to touch her friend's shoulder, freezing her in place. Kitten, the sultry, hot voice echoed in her mind, and the writer in her was unable to stop herself from grabbing the fountain pen and creating a mental scenario. The soft but powerful hands held her wrists together above her head. Furs couldn't help but let out a moan at the touch. Her bare back rested on the soft sheets beneath her as a huge body was placed on top of her. The red-haired figure lowered his head and placed his mouth on her neck, giving it a soft but deep bite, marking her as his own. No. No. Bad Furs. Bad. The blush exploded and reached the tips of her ears. Furs looked down at her hands with troubled eyes, trembling in horror at the realization of the scenario she had fantasized about. I am a bottom, refusing to accept such a reality and trying to escape as fast as possible from the above scenario. Furs looked at her friend with a somewhat forced smile and a heavy blush on her cheeks. Zio, my good friend. What did I mean Mr. K. Kenway give you? At her slip of the tongue, Furs bit her lips hard, and her eyes couldn't help but move to the aforementioned man, who had his eyes closed and was leaning back in his chair. Lucky. He's asleep. Lowering her hands, Zio looked up slightly and grabbed the paper, unfolding it. She stared listlessly at it before her eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Jumping up from her chair in shock, Zio's mouth opened and closed. This. At such a reaction from her friend, Furs excitedly stood up and looked over her shoulder. What is it? What is it? Or don't tell me. More money. I bet. It is. Excitement and words were dying as her sight was reading each word. Scratching her eyes to make sure she was seeing right, Furs started with the first sentence. The following of Sheriff. Main ingredients. The following of Trickmaster. Main ingredients. Both women gawked at this and slowly turned to look at a reclining Adrian, who had one eye open and was sparkling with amusement. What did I say? I'd take good care of you, right? Final Volume 2, Fire Mage. True Title Volume 2, Murphy's Law.